Rogue Knight by Illuviar. 141st, Chapter 35, Parts 1 and 2. Phase 35, The Lost Fleet. RK equals. Part 1, Conference Room, Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Western Sector Fleet Flagship, Bespin. When the enemy is on the offensive, then days could be an eternity. It's worse when you are out of contact and left wondering what the criff was happening. With the whole western quadrant cut off from access to the rest of the Republic and the holonet being jammed, there was not much that the commanders of the sector fleet units at Bespin could tell me besides the state of the enemy advance in the region. To my utter lack of surprise, the news were quite grim. "I'm honestly surprised you managed to pass through Syria before the clanker could secure it, sir," Rear Admiral Vex said. He was the clone in charge of all units at Bespin before my arrival to take command. "We made a good time." Holt agreed. "We left scouts behind at Lauta. They informed us that heavy enemy units entered the system 4 hours ago. So we've got a day at best to get your ships resupplied, General," Vex said after glancing at the map of the sector floating above the table we were all sitting at. While Nothoyan is still held by the rest of the fleet, Dollar should be under assault already, and the clankers should have dispatched a force to Garam to finish encircling our forces there. "You mentioned a good news, Admiral," I asked. The positioning of both enemy and friendly forces was quite interesting. "It's Ari Adu, sir." The clone smiled. While some of us had reservations about getting a newly promoted Rear Admiral in charge of the whole sector fleet, he proved us wrong, sir. Admiral Tennant is still holding Ari Adu itself along with its moon. However, the outer and inner system are under enemy control. His last transmission indicates that at least a third of a Separatist sector fleet, along with the Confederacy's second fleet, were assaulting his position. He's determined to hold them off for as long as possible. I nodded thoughtfully. If our intelligence is correct, and the information you provided seems to indicate that's the case, we can expect almost half a sector fleet to converge on Garam in the next 48 hours. "That's correct, sir. While the enemy has left light forces to cover the hyperlane junctions and bottle up any important planets we're holding, my staff estimates that approximately half the total Separatist forces assaulting the quadrant are converging on Garam," Vex confirmed. "How reliable are the locals there?" "What forces do they possess?" Holt asked. "A decent-sized defense navy and some fortifications, ma'am. We're talking about this sector's capital world. As for reliability," Vex shrugged. "I can't say for sure." "I would have preferred more time, Admiral Vex. At least a week. 2 would be better, however that was wishful thinking. The Freedom has some good simulators. I want all captains on board in the next 3 hours. We'll be practicing fleet operations until the resupply is done. We'll leave for Garam late so we can be there after the bulk of the enemy forces arrives. Have a messenger sent to Nothoyan. I want the rest of the fleet to join us there. The Separatists believe that they can take this sector on the cheap and then send the bulk of their forces to more strategically important locations. We're going to prove them wrong. We'll destroy as many of their fleet at Garam, then move to Ari Adu, crushing anything standing in our way before kicking the enemy from that system too." Vex looked at the map and smiled coldly. While it was true that the local sector fleet simply lacked the numbers and firepower to meet everything the CIS was throwing their way, especially when their new love for ramming tactics were taken into account, the forces I brought were heavy on capital ships, and the Freedom herself was powerful enough to crush a fleet by herself. My original plan was to resupply and get out of here as fast as possible. The fact that Tennant was still holding Ari Adu and thus tying up a lot of enemy forces changed things. That his orders led to a full half of his original command waiting for me intact. That altered the strategic situation significantly. Even with half a sector fleet coming to the Garam, we were going to have a solid firepower if not numerical advantage. RK equals. Jedi Master, Shark T's quarters, Tipoca City, Camino. "This is the situation, Master T." Master Rancisis finished explaining everything that had happened on Coruscant. He had arrived mere hours before the Confederacy launched their offensive and practically cut off Camino from the Republic. The reinforcements he brought were going to be vital for holding the system once the enemy broke through the fleets defending the hyperlanes leading to Camino. However, the news Ramesses waited almost 2 weeks to share made T on edge. It didn't take her long to figure out why did he wait. Right now, the only way to contact Coruscant, waste a single powerful transmitter that had enough range to reach the core, even with the holonet jammed, and the place was under guard by a Cathar contingent brought by Master Ramesses. While welcomed, their presence has been a surprise for the Togruta, one that her fellow council member finally decided to dispel. The Jedi were planning a coup, and she had been instrumental in persuading some of them that it was going to be necessary. Honestly, T wasn't sure what to think about that. While she was convinced that Vale was up to no good and was using the Republic as he used her, the Jedi Master had qualms with what the Council planned to do. Tai had been equally shocked and resigned when she heard of the way Master Teen's address to the Senate went. It made her think what led to such an outcome. She watched a recording of the debates multiple times and reached some unsettling conclusions. Speaking with some of the clones, who were simply put furious with her, made other things clear. The Jedi were failing in their duties to the people of the Republic. OT knew that the Sith had a hand in shaping the public perception, making the Jedi's failing appear worse than they really were, something that made her even more furious with Vale. Please repeat that. I want to be sure I've understood the Council's instructions correctly. Shak T sighed and looked at Ramesses through narrowed eyes. We expect that Vale will head to Camino if we still hold this system after he fight his way through the Separatists in the Western Quadrant. When he arrives, his forces will be depleted and he would likely be exhausted after utilizing battle meditation as often as he needs to. Once he arrives, you're to request a meeting so you can apologize for the troubles you've caused him. One in person here in Tipoca City. When he lands, we'll engage him along with the forces I've brought. Ramesses explained. Tai closed her eyes. She could see the twisted logic. If she could control her emotions, she might be able to fool Vale. Might. In doing so, she would prove to all the clones who were under her command that they were right about her, about their mistrust of the Jedi. Even if they somehow managed to take Vale out, the army wasn't going to just accept such a betrayal. If there was one thing she was sure of, that was it. Win or lose, the Council's orders were a suicide. I see, Shak T whispered. By the Force, how things got so bad. I trust you'll do what's required of you, Master Tai, Ramesses asked. I'll do my duty. T nodded. She told him the truth too. Shak T just needed to figure out what her duty was and to whom. Part 2. Flag Bridge. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. Garentham System. A day of simulating training and a few hours of contingency planning for the battle we expected to fight were very far from enough to consider my new command to be combat ready. Simply throwing 2 fleets which hadn't trained for weeks into a single unit and expecting them to excel was folly, one I was forced to use anyway. That's why the plan we decided on was basic. We weren't going to use a combined fleet from the start. Vex's command was going to strike the Confederate forces coming from Isde Naha, while my own fleet was going to deal with the enemy contingent arriving from Giroch. Whichever group took care of their clankers first would assist the other. Once the system was secure, we would commence repairs, have a chat with the locals, and decide what our next course of action would be. Ideally, we might even be able to jump the force coming from Lorta, though that was mostly wishful thinking. Once they learned of our victory, and wasn't that a bit of wishful thinking too, those Separatists would be pulling back the way they came if they knew what was good for them. The simulations were useful for something at least. Joanna hummed. The tactical display hovering in front of us was updating, and the combined fleet was more or less where it was supposed to be. Mostly less, to be honest. I wasn't going to be pulling anything requiring too much precision with this force for the foreseeable future. It was a good thing that with the freedom here, good old-fashioned brute force was going to work splendidly. Yes, I nodded. We don't need to spend too long straightening up our formations. To be fair, both fleets, mine and Vex's, were individually deployed rather well after exiting hyperspace. The discrepancies could be seen only when comparing the rough positions of the 2 forces with what they should have been. Sir, we're getting a feed from the scouts, Holt's aide said. He, along with Piet, was acting as a third of our staff after Atrizia. We're inputting the sensor data now, my own aide added. The plot shifted again. There was a lot of traffic in system, though most of it was busy scattering. Two large blobs of red symbols were advancing towards Gerentham after prudently jumping on the north and south edges of the system. There were flashing dots spreading in front of the enemy forces, designating scouts searching for trouble. There were at least 100 ships, a third of them cruisers, near the sector capital. They were in formation along with a lot of smaller, unidentified contacts. It was a decent-sized force, however each of the Separatists' task forces coming at them had more than enough ships and firepower to take them on and win. The plans are go. Admiral Vex, you're taking on the Southern Force. We'll deal with their friends up north. Admiral Holt, we're going to test what we trained for while waiting for Crimson to raise its ugly head. You have tactical control of TF-1. I'm moving my flag to the Remembrance and taking control of TF-2. Have the insertion calculations ready by the time I arrive, I ordered. Piet, you're with me. Aye, sir. My aide jumped to follow me. May the Force serve you well in the battle to come, Admiral Holt. I nodded at the Corellian woman and headed to the nearest hangar. Finding both enemy forces in system and approaching the capital cautiously was less than ideal. We waited a bit longer before heading this way, hoping that they would be deeper in the system, preferably engaging the locals when we arrived, though we could work with this too. It just meant that the enemy had better odds at salvaging more of its forces. =RK equals CIC Mandalorian Cruiser Remembrance, 2 light hours from Gerentham. While Vex's fleet wasn't ready to execute any complicated tactical move along with my own forces, I actually had some time to drill my fleet before heading for Atrizia. While the hit the chain of command took thanks to Crimson was very bad, I had the captains gathered on the Freedom for most of our time in the unknown regions, and we got busy in the simulators. It paid off. The fleet divided in 2 groups centered around the Freedom and my silencer-equipped cruiser before jumping at the Northern Force. We emerged at the enemy's flanks and began moving in opposite directions. Thanks to having the Freedom, Holt's TF-1 was heading towards the enemy's front, where they could concentrate most of their firepower, while my own TF-2 was going to sling along wrecking everything in range before turning to hit the Confederate formation from behind. If we had more of the senior command staff from before Atrizia, I would have had 2 more task forces hitting the enemy from above and below. Captain, fire at will. Concentrate on their light ships. Beware ramming attempts. Launch fighters and keep them as cap, I ordered. The Remembrance was commanded by one of the clones under Trek, he recommended, before leaving to get the next 2 silencer-equipped cruisers to Pelion at Mandalore before we headed for Atrizia. His name was Kilo, and from what I saw during the simulations, he had a decent head for tactics on his shoulder, even if he lacked experience. Silencer is charged, Piet announced from his station behind me. Fire once you have the maximum number of targets locked in. I smiled. It's been too long since I've seen that weapon deployed. To their credit, whoever was in charge of the Confederate fleet reacted fast. The first salvos just went in when the CIS fleet accelerated in attempt to get away from the killing ground formed between my 2 task forces. Unfortunately for them, Holt was accelerating parallel to their course and unleashing hell upon them as she overtook the enemy formation. Targets locked in, firing, Piet exclaimed. 12 intact munificents vanished from the tactical display. Keep the silencer covered while it recharges, I advised. Have the TF move 10 degrees to starboard, 5 degrees down, I added after watching the enemy react. Swarms of vultures were already launching and attempting to close with us. Fortunately, the enemy didn't wait until they were all out and threw them in on big group. Instead, they came piecemeal, and most of them were devoured by the Guardian, Cap, and our own frigates, which were all concentrated on the starboard side of my formation. That enemy action was understandable. They were losing a lot of munificence fast, and if they didn't get their vultures off ASAP and sent our way, they were going to get blown up for no gain. This way, the droid fighters were going to at least cost us some of our own, and at least soften up, if not take out some frigates too. Needless to say, the enemy wasn't faring particularly good, especially on their other flank. The Freedom could unleash half her weapon at anything coming into range, and only the battleships could survive such concentrated firepower for more than a few seconds. The munificence that ran afoul of the Corellian ship simply blew up after the first salvo that made contact with them. Even better, for the first couple of minutes, the Freedom drew the fire of everything that could target her, and her shields didn't even waver. Before the Confederate commander could comprehend what was happening over there and change targeting priorities, that whole flank was being systematically shattered, and Holt wasn't going to give them a chance to reform. Things on my end weren't going as well, which was as expected. While my TF2 was actually larger, even with the silencer we had at most, a third of the firepower Joanna could throw at the enemy. The Freedom made that much of a difference. Good work, weapons. Now target that munificent division trying to pull up, the captain ordered. The silencer is almost charged, Captain, Piet reported. Get us 5 more degrees to the starboard and target that battleship. Have our division concentrate fire on it after the silencer hits it. Once it's disabled, continue targeting the munificence. Kilo ordered. It was a good call. We were almost past the enemy formation, and that Lucra Hulk was one of the last things that might slow us down while we completed our turn and could take the CIS fleet from behind. I called both sensor and optical feed in front of me to watch how the silencer was going to perform against a battleship. It already proved itself against the munificence, and it was going to be a great tool in neutralizing the numerical advantage the enemy usually enjoyed. If it was reasonably effective against modern battle wagons too, it was going to be even better. Weapon clear, target locked, firing, Piet announced. 10 crimson beams flashed from the hangar bay and struck the Lucra Hulk at the same time. For a brief moment, its shield blazed as it struggled to stop the incoming firepower. Then it failed at the points of contact, and the diminished energy lances struck the ship itself. Armor simply detonated and took everything around with itself. While the battleship was still operational and the damage it suffered was concentrated in the areas struck by the silencer, its shields were depleted. The first salvo that hit it afterward popped them. The next slammed in the exposed hull as my ships began dismantling the Lucra Hulk. Yet even as it was dying, it spat back its defiance. A CR-90 was unfortunate enough to run straight into the return fire and simply vanished, and it was soon followed by a light cruiser that broke in two after mere seconds of bombardment. Meanwhile, the enemy vultures had concentrated their remaining numbers, and the CIS commander chose to throw them all at the Freedom in a last-ditch attempt to cripple her. Despite everything Holt managed to throw their way, the range was too low, and the droid fighters managed to break through. Those that lived long enough to do so might have been enough to cripple a smaller, more lightly armored ship. However, the Freedom had been built to survive a tremendous amount of punishment, even after her shields failed. All the vultures could achieve was to disable some sensor clusters and weapon emplacements, and with a single notable exception, all of those were either secondary guns or Guardian clusters. The Remembrance's division finished off the Lucra Hulk it was targeting, and my TF was completing its turn when the Confederate commander had enough. The enemy fleet broke and dispersed with ships fleeing in hyperspace as fast as they could. Limited pursuit is authorized. Concentrate on disabling enemy hyperdrives. The moment they are all gone, resume offensive formation and have nav coordinates locked to Admiral Vex's force, I ordered. Seeing the enemy force simply break was beautiful. To be honest, it wasn't something I expected by a Confederacy force. Given the expendable nature of their crews and lighter ships, they were usually content with accepting losses that would shatter the morale of a traditional navy. To a lesser extent, the same was true for the clone crewed and commanded units of the GAR. In the right circumstances, such a trait could be a great boon. However, it sometimes led to losses that could be otherwise avoided. RK equals CIC Republic Cruiser for Honor, 3 light hours from Garantham. Admiral Vex didn't attempt anything fancy. While the enemy outnumbered his forces, he was most certainly not outgunned, and the fleet units from Nothoyan should be arriving shortly. That's why he chose to meet the enemy head-on. He was going to concentrate their attention on his fleet, and when the time came close in, to deny them an easy escape in hyperspace. Vex ordered all fighters and bombers launched after his fleet reverted back to real space and ordered the later to move to the back of the fleet. He was going to keep them in reserve until the enemy force was broken and tried to flee. The torrents, on the other hand, were going to aid the frigates and guardians in fending off the Separatists' vultures. We've got targeting solutions across the fleet, One of the clones making up the Admiral's staff reported, "Fire at will. The targeting priority stands." Vex ordered. Blue and red turbo laser bolts, crisis crossed through space and ships began dying. The escorts took the brunt of the casualties during the initial engagement. CR-90 and light cruisers were dying almost as fast as the enemy was losing munificence. Tens of thousands of vultures threw themselves against Vex's fleet and were met by torrents with missile and laser fire after the Guardian missiles softened them up. Whole squadrons of droid fighters were vanishing as they raced through the distance between the fleets. Then they slammed into a wall of fire when the CR-90s and the Guardians began engaging them with their AA guns. Some broke through only to be jumped on by torrents left in reserve. To Vex, it looked like someone was launching fireworks around his leading ships as hundreds of fighters dueled while shot at by the Guardian. The Admiral felt relief when the vultures failed to do more than lightly damage a pair of Venators and a single acclamator before being mopped up. One of his fears was that the clankers had found a way to negate the Guardian, in which case the huge number of droid fighters they had could have been decisive. With the vulture threat handled, Vex could concentrate all his attention on the fleet engagement. The enemy had decided that they were losing too many munificence and the frigates were peeling off to go to the flanks, and their battle line was advancing. Now things were going to get really ugly as more and more battleships were getting into effective range. Begin targeting the Lucra hulks. I want multiple cruiser and assault ship divisions to concentrate fire on a single battleship, Vex ordered. Enough firepower to shatter continents was concentrated on single capital ships. It was slow and hard, yet they began to die. Acclamators were turned into floating coffins. Venators began falling out of formation, if lucky, or simply shattering when two or more Lucra hulks concentrated on them. The battleships didn't go unscratched either. One after another, they began to lose shields and were racked by the Republic's furious response. Suddenly, the enemy formation broke. Their remaining munificence charged Vex's fleet at ramming vectors, while the battleships went to go around his fleet. "Admiral, General Vale has defeated the enemy northern force and will be arriving to assist us in 2 minutes," a staff member announced. "That explains it. Begin independent maneuvering. Escorts, keep those munificence off our backs. The fleet is to disperse and block those battleships from escaping," Vex ordered. For the next few minutes, the battle turned into chaotic melee as the enemy fleet attempted to disengage. There were no formations, just pure chaos as the two forces continued to tear each other apart. Vale's arrival should have broken the enemy, however the Republic's luck ran out. A minute after the general engaged the southern force and began reducing it in earnest, the Confederate fleet from Lutrilia arrived and joined the melee. The chaos grew further when the forces from Nothoyan finally arrived, and the locals decided to head for the giant furball too. All Vex could do at that moment was to watch and pray. There was no commanding such madness. Suddenly things changed. The very idea that the Republic could lose the battle vanished from Vex's mind. He knew that victory was at hand, knew what his ships were about to do, even if proper communication was all but impossible thanks to the jamming and ECM thrown around by everyone. All he had to do was command the few ships close enough for comms to work, because he was somehow aware what everyone else in the Republic fleet in the system was doing. It was time to end this madness. "Turn us 20 degrees to port. Half speed. Concentrate fire to the starboard." Vex began issuing orders in earnest. The Republic was going to win. He was certain of it. 142nd. Chapter 35, Parts 3 and 4. Disclaimer: I do not own Gundam Seed or Star Wars. They belong to their respective copyright owners. This story is not created with commercial aim. I make no money from it. Phase 35, The Lost Fleet. =RK equals. Part 3. Flag Bridge. Corellian Cruiser Freedom. High orbit above Gerentham. The final tally is up along with our best estimate of enemy losses. Piet came next to the chair where I was vegetating after using battle meditation before getting the chance to fully recover after atrizia. Only a cocktail of stimulants and alchemy-produced concoctions kept my head more or less in the game, something that was necessary. In less than an hour, representatives from Gerentham would be getting on board to discuss the aftermath of the battle, and I needed my head straight for that talk. "Tell me, our losses first," I ordered. Piet looked at the datapad in his hands and nodded grimly. We lost 11 Venators, with 16 more suffering various degree of damage. At least 4 won't be able to keep up with the fleet. Perhaps 2 more. Damage assessment is still underway there. My aide began listing the bad news. To think that the battle began so well, before my luck finally ran out. The assault ship losses are even worse. 17 acclimators are confirmed destroyed. 2 more are little more than wrecks for the braking yards, with 6 damaged. Another pair will need an extensive stay in a shipyard before they could be considered combat capable. Piet continued. His tone reflected his thought on our victory. It was better than getting killed by the Separatists, but that was all you could say about it. If it wasn't for my gamble with the battle meditation when it became clear we were losing, this battle could have seen my entire command annihilated. Only the Freedom and a few lucky ships might have made it out of the melee, considering how many of the enemy frigates and destroyers went on suicide runs when everyone lost control of the engagement. The heavy cruisers got gutted, sir. 6 lost, 1 is a wreck, and another got its engines torn out by a ramming attack. The good news continued to come. The only good thing after this debacle was that the Confederacy had only 1 remaining task force that could engage us anytime soon. It should be arriving at Nothoyan soon, and I had dispatched scouts to keep an eye on them and apprise me of numbers and force composition. Even with my fleet mauled, we should have more than enough forces to crush that bunch. The Freedom by herself should be able to do so comfortably. Our escorts took the brunt of the casualties. Piet grunted. 18 light cruisers, 24 consular frigates, and 59 of the CR-90s are destroyed, while most of the remaining frigates are combat capable. The preliminary estimates are that at least 10 of the light cruisers won't be able to leave the system without extensive repairs. Piet concluded. What do we have left that can get underway in the next 24 to 48 hours? I asked. Piet turned his attention to the datapad he was holding and began typing commands. If we wasted too long here, Ari Adu could fall, and if that happened, the Confederacy would be able to concentrate their remaining forces in the nearby sectors against us. We needed to relieve that planet and make sure we wouldn't be intercepted by superior forces before I would be able to use battle meditation again. It was another question how well I would be able to handle the technique without a few weeks, perhaps a month of recovery time. This is my best guess, sir. Piet handed me the datapad. 1 Corellian cruiser, Freedom, lightly damaged. 10 Venators, including 1 silencer equipped, 3 lightly to moderately damaged. 12 acclimators/4 lightly to moderately damaged, 2 dreadnought heavy cruisers, 1 moderately damaged, 9 light cruisers, 5 lightly damaged, 11 consular frigates, 3 lightly damaged, 15 CR-90 frigates, 2 lightly damaged. I was left with a quite powerful fleet, even without counting the Freedom or the silencer. However, it was a pale shadow compared to the forces I had before engaging the enemy. Speaking about the Separatist bastards, I browsed the data on the pad until I found the estimates. 300 munificent frigates, 144 recusant light destroyers, 22 Lucrehulk battleships, 71,000 fighters. If true, I had just won a great victory, and the only reasons why my whole command hadn't been wiped out were the battle meditation and the incredible firepower and defenses on the Corellian cruiser. I wouldn't be able to rely on the former for the time being. Even worse, with the loss of so many ships, the chain of command was in tatters, and what remained of the fleet would be less effective now that I would be unable to cheat. I needed to discuss our situation with both Joanna and Vex, though unless there was something I hadn't considered, our best course of action was simple. We simply had to relieve Ari Adu and hope that some of the forces there were still reasonably intact. Otherwise, fighting my way to Camino might turn out to be a pipe dream. Good job, Piet. Go make sure that the ships in best condition receive priority on supplies and parts for the repairs. We'll be leaving in 2 days at the latest. I want a confirmation on what portion of the fleet will be combat capable and able to keep up at flank speed, both in hyper and real space. I'll make sure of it, sir. My aide saluted and left after I handed him back the datapad. Now I had to finish preparing to meet the locals. =RK=. Joanna got back from her inspection on the Freedom a few minutes before our visitors arrived and crashed in a seat next to mine. While she had done a great deal of progress, Holt was far from being at 100% after a Trizia. We'll be 10% down in combat capability until we can get back to Corellia, and the shield systems are damaged. 12 to 15% below maximum until the engineers could overhaul some of the components. We'll need at least a week or more of safety for that. Guardian effectiveness is down 30% due to destroyed weapon emplacements and sensor clusters. We can bring it back to 90 with the spares on board. Joanna grumbled. She was obviously pissed off that her ship had taken such damage, no matter that any lesser spacecraft would have been gutted by such amount of punishment. I wisely didn't say aloud that all things considered we got off lightly. "Did you go over the dossiers of our guests?" Joanna asked after a short silence. Her tone told me all I needed to know about her feeling as far as the locals were concerned. "Yes, there isn't much we have in our database. Most came from Vex's ship. All we got was names and job description," I answered. "Not much to go on. They didn't aid us until it became clear we were going to win." Holt grumbled. "True. At least they saved a few of our ships. While my battered force could take on the locals, thanks to the freedom, any further engagements here weren't going to gain us anything. I needed them as either reluctant allies or neutrals willing to take Republic credits at worst. Otherwise, I might be forced to write off most of my damaged ships and reduce the locals' naval presence in order to keep them from aiding the enemy. The situation was less than ideal. Many more were crippled or destroyed because they didn't come to our aid when we really needed them." Holt growled. "I'm less than pleased, Joanna. You can trust me about that. If I had my way, I would see the locals paying for what was at the very least gross incompetence and at worst treason. While I wasn't going to get what I wanted, I would be content with receiving what my fleet needed right now. Properly dealing with the Garentham government could wait until the war was resolved. Getting into another fight right now won't serve our interests, no matter how much certain parties deserve to be turned into space dust." Holt nodded stiffly and glared at the door. RK equals. Part 4, Flag Bridge, Corellian Cruiser Freedom, high orbit above Garentham. For what little it was worth it, the dossiers were correct. The two visitors led in by a Coruscant escort were splitting images of the pictures we had in our database. "General Vale, Admiral Holt, welcome to Garentham. I wish we met under better circumstances." An aging man wearing the light blue uniform of the local navy greeted us. "I'm Admiral Neo Lind, commander of the Garentham Naval Forces." He introduced himself. Lind was a human with short greying hair and piercing brown eyes. He had beard that reminded me of Kenobi's, though the Admiral's was shorter. Next to him stood a tall, middle-aged woman. She gave us a small, formal bow and a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "The Fig Consortium welcomes you to Garentham. I'm the CEO, Marissa Fig." The image in our files obviously failed to capture the woman's presence. While she had striking features, tall cheekbones, a face that was a product of either great genetics or a plastic surgeon, probably both, what got my attention, it was the air she carried around her. The man was a predator accustomed to getting what she wanted by any means necessary. Her presence here told me a lot. Instead of a diplomat or another high-ranking member of the government, it was the CEO of one of the biggest corporations on the planet who came to represent Garentham's civilian leadership. "Admiral Lind, Miss Fig." I kept my voice bland, disinterested. "You will provide basing, supplies, and repair facilities for my damaged ships, as well as resupply for the rest of my fleet. I'll be taking a third of your battle line along with appropriate escorts to relieve Ari Adu. You'll be suitably compensated by the Republic Treasury for your troubles. Resupplying your fleet and aiding in its repair won't be an issue. However, given the unsure times we live in, waiting for payment from the Senate won't be acceptable." Fig's smile never wavered. For all we know, the funds to cover our expenses might not be available considering what is happening in the core. "I'm afraid that we'll need every ship we have to protect Garentham, General." Lind managed to look quite apologetic. "Considering the number of Separatist forces that assaulted this system mere hours ago." The Admiral gasped for breath when I focused my will through the Force and constricted his airways. "Are you two along with your government under the impression that this is a negotiation?" I made sure my voice sounded amused. "Garentham is a republic world. When two Republic fleets engaged superior Separatist forces coming in to conquer your planet, your fleet declined to offer any support until it was clear who was going to emerge victorious. The amusement in my voice was replaced by ice. Your only saving grace is that you chose not to openly side with the Separatist, Admiral Lind. Otherwise, right now my forces would be making sure that Garam would be unable to provide any support for the enemies of the Republic. I let my grip on the man's throat go. Even such a small thing set my nerves on fire, though I managed to keep my neutral expression in place. "You won't get away with—" The man bristled. "Spare me. You're obviously put up to take all the blame, Admiral. When my report of the battle gets back to Coruscant, the Senate will want someone's head for the failure of the Garantham's navy to engage the enemy before the battle was won. I can assure you, GAR High Command will want the same. Have a half of your fleet ready to depart in 36 hours, Admiral Lind. You'll be leading them. If you distinguish yourself at Ari Adu, you might even save yourself from taking all the blame." Dismissed. I looked at the CEO, who kept an unwavering mask in place, yet I could sense she was disturbed by my actions. Lind glared at me. However, he gave us a stiff salute before turning around and marching out of the compartment. "Are you going to dictate terms to our government and corporations too, General?" Fig asked. Her voice held a trace of amusement and was otherwise calm, in direct contrast with the emotions coming from her. There was a bit of fear, a lot of anticipation, and not a little anger and indignation that I could sense. "It can be arranged. If you decline to deal with the Senate's treasury, I'll have to simply requisition what my fleet needs," I said. "Doing so will earn you and the Republic a lot of enemies, not only on Garam, but in this whole sector," Fig countered. "So far, you've proven yourselves anything but friends to the Republic. Sooner than later, there would no longer be place for such indecisiveness in this war. My bet is on sooner." "That's a bold claim, General. You aren't speaking for the Senate," Fig said. "I don't have to." I chuckled. With this offensive, the Confederacy and those supporting them, openly or not, committed the one sin the Senate won't forgive. They're proving themselves a credible threat for the core worlds. Can the Republic count on the Fig Consortium, or should I contact your competitors? They can't provide you with everything you'll need in any reasonable time frame. The CEO sounded very sure of herself. "If I'm not working with your corporation, there is nothing stopping me from simply requisitioning the necessary equipment from your and blacklisting your consortium in both Republic and Mandalorian space." Fig stared at me in disbelief. That certainly wasn't what she was expecting, even after she saw me deal with Lind. "It won't be so simple, and you well know it, General," Fig protested. "You mean your people might prove difficult, alter or destroy manifests, misplace or sabotage equipment. I'll consider anything in that vein as treason and Garam siding openly with the Confederacy. You people already proved yourselves as unreliable. Treason isn't a big step down." "The Senate won't stand for this," Fig snapped. "On the contrary, there will be enough senators eager to make an example of an outer rim world, especially a sector capital, if it means it might keep the other in line. After all, too many of the worlds in the outer rim openly sided with the Separatists." "And you wonder why?" Fig sneered. "It's obvious, actually. The problem you people had in my time are simply worse nowadays." I nodded. "Their mistake was in backing the wrong side in this civil war, Miss Fig. Not if the Confederacy wins. They had the opportunity to achieve a military victory months ago and squandered it. This offensive of theirs will cause a lot of damage." I made a dismissive gesture. "All it's going to achieve in the end is prolonging the war and getting even more people needlessly killed. I'll ask you again, Miss Fig, can the Republic work with your consortium or not?" "We'll provide what you need," Fig said through gritted teeth. "See that you do. I'll hold you personally responsible for any accident. Have a nice day, Miss Fig." I slumped back in my chair when the woman left. "What happened with being reasonable?" Holt snorted. "I didn't hear you utter a word. You're in charge of this fiasco and actually could speak for the Republic. As you very well know, right now the situation between Corellia and the Republic is complicated. Besides, I agree, we can't trust the locals. That's why I want as much of their fleet at Ari Adu." I nodded. "You intend to place them in the position of most danger?" Joanna raised an eyebrow after she reached that conclusion. That too. I'll want to give a fighting chance to our crippled ships. We'll have to leave here anyway if the locals get any ideas. I admitted. Who knows, they might even see sense. After all, once we've relieved Ari Adu, the Separatists won't be able to spare the forces for another major push in the region for some time. There's that. So this is your idea of gaining reluctant allies? Joanna asked. I'll admit that mine wasn't the best possible approach. However, my patience for self-serving politicians is gone after my last dealings with the Senate. Please advise our people to keep a close eye on our hosts. It's unlikely that they'll do something particularly dumb with the freedom around, but I've learned not to underestimate people's stupidity. I slowly got up to my feet and groaned as my body protested. I needed to get some shut-eye before I criffed up even more. 143rd Interlude. The Unknown Enemy, I. Interlude, The Unknown Enemy 1. RK equals. Safe House, Coruscant. A human male who appeared to be middle-aged sat behind a desk in a small, comfortable apartment he had been calling a home for the last decade. He had spent most of that time acting as an information broker, providing the movers and shakers on Coruscant with all the dirt and juicy rumors they craved. His work and all the contacts he made while doing it was in fact very close to his real one. The man who was known as Alan Gray was a spy, one who worked for a power unknown in this galaxy. The agent put aside the data pad he was examining and put it next to a stack of pads, then pulled out a data chip from his pocket and inserted it into the terminal built into his desk. He typed his password, waited for a biometric scan, and began writing his impressions on the topic that had his attention at this time. The war wasn't going as expected, which wasn't exactly a bad thing. The more the locals tore themselves apart, the easier his people's task would be once they arrived in force. However, there were some wild elements that needed to be studied and accounted for in the report to the fleet masters and the shapers. Gray was busy studying the actions of one such anomaly. Even after pressing all his contacts for more information, he knew less than he needed about the man. The spy frowned as what he knew began taking shape on the monitor. First, he concentrated on the man's major actions and achievements, to date with more to be added as it became available. Once that was done, Gray was going to open another file, where he would be adding his conclusions and theories based on the facts he had. Rhodia, bodyguard duty. Vale is hired to act as Senator Amidala's bodyguard. When she is betrayed by her longtime friend, the Rhodian Senator Fer, Delcatar engages CIS droid contingent on the ground and dispatches it. After securing the site, Vale persuaded Fer to aid him in setting up an ambush for Separatist reinforcements, who are en route to pick up Amidala. The ambush is successful, and Delcatar eliminates the CIS contingent, including 2 Dark Jedi twins, Karok and Vinrock, trained by Dooku. He also captures Newt Gunray, who was eager to get his hands on Amidala. Reinforcements, led by Jedi Master Shak Ti and Padawan Ahsoka Tano, arrive at that time. A delay follows, while the powers that be on Coruscant decide how to transport Gunray to the capital. Vale insists to accompany his captive in order to ensure he is safely delivered. Thanks to the delay, the Separatists have enough time to mount a rescue and assault the Republic cruiser Tranquility, with Gunray, Vale, Shak Ti and Ahsoka Tano on board. During the ensuing battle, Tai and Tano engage Ventress, while Vale is dealing with another of Dooku's dark acolytes and various droid units. The result is a dead Dark Jedi, multiple clone casualties. Gunray and a traitor in the Senate Guard, who was supposed to deliver the captive for interrogation, are killed by Vale while attempting to escape. At that point, Grievous arrives along with CIS reinforcements to make sure that Gunray is either rescued or silenced. Vale launches in a Torrent fighter along with all surviving pilots in an attempt to slow down the enemy until reinforcements could arrive. Meanwhile, back on Rhodia, an ensign who has the bridge watch on the acclimator Dauntless gives the order to immediately launch. The assault ship is the first to arrive to aid the Tranquility and turns the tide of the battle. Vale AKS-4 and receives infantry support from Piet, then leads a raid to capture Grievous, along with Jedi Shak Ti and Ahsoka Tano. Vale engages Asajj Ventress and captures her. At the same time, Shak Ti and a platoon of clone troopers run into Grievous and manage to subdue him. The consequences are profound. With Grievous captured, the CIS war effort staggers, giving the Republic forces across the galaxy a sorely needed reprieve, no matter how brief. As a consequence of his success, after all, it was Vale's idea to go after Grievous, the Sith is offered a commission in the GAR by Chancellor Palpatine, which he accepts. Naboo, the Blue Shadow Crisis. A tactical droid is taken out by local forces. Slicing into its systems leads to the discovery of a CIS research facility in the swamps. The Queen and Senator Amidala requests Jedi support. Vale is dispatched to resolve the situation with a promise for Jedi support once it becomes available. By the time the general arrives, Senator Amidala had gone ahead to investigate and had been captured. Vale, along with a clone unit under his command, assaults the research facility. Which turns out to be a bioweapon creation lab, ran by Dr. Vindi. During the assault, unknown agents release the weapon in the river, passing through Theed City. Before containment could be enacted, a huge portion of the water network on Naboo is contaminated, and the planet has to be placed under quarantine. Vale interrogates Vindi and finds out what he needs to produce a cure. A Republic task force goes to the world of Thousand Moons, where a certical component for curing Blue Shadow could be found. There, Vale meets Jabo, a local orphan who he takes as his first apprentice. The necessary substance is retrieved, and production of Blue Shadow cure begins immediately. However, it remains necessary for Naboo to be under quarantine until the bioweapon on the surface could be eradicated. The Republic Navy is forced to station quite a powerful fleet to enforce it. As a consequence of the casualties who die before sufficient amount of the cure could be produced, a radical shift in Naboo societies begin. Within months, the majority of the population loses their pacifistic ideals and begin the creation of proper army and navy. They request technical assistance from the GAR forces maintaining the blockade and receive it. Another consequence is the effect the bioweapon attack has on the Confederacy's image. Their credibility take a major hit, and many who were supportive of their stated agenda begin to have second thoughts. All Confederate declarations of innocence are considered mere propaganda. The raid on Coruscant. Shortly after Vale returns from Naboo, CIS forces and mercenaries hired by the Separatist execute a daring raid on the Republic capital. Using infiltrators, sleeper agents, and a freighter load EV with orbit-to-surface weapons, Confederate forces attack Coruscant. GAR High Command is struck by bombs built into various maintenance droids, including some containing Blue Shadow. In one fell swoop, the Republic military staff is decapitated. At the same time, the freighter Tranquility executes a series of orbital strikes at the GAR bases nearest to the Senate. Again, Blue Shadow is used in order to slow down any response. Further, the Senate is taken over by mercenaries and commando droids. Chancellor Palpatine, under duress, orders the release of General Grievous. After contacting Commodore Pelion in orbit, General Vale is updated on the situation and assumes command of the GAR forces on Coruscant. He intercepts Senator Taff, who is carrying the orders to release the cyborg, and Grievous remain in Republic custody. While Coruscant is gripped by chaos, a CIS strike force attacks the Jedi Temple. It is comprised by an unexpectedly large number of Dark Jedi who manage soon get the upper hand thanks to the element of surprise, droid backup, and the fact that most Jedi are spread all over the galaxy. General Vale, who is on his way back to the Senate, diverts and moves to reinforce the Jedi, along with what forces he has managed to gather. In the chaos, one of Dooku's acolytes, Cadrian Say, enacts a rescue. While they make their way out of the temple, Mace Windu intercepts them. At roughly the same time, Ventress is freed too, and she goes to join the battle. In the Jedi Temple's Great Hall, Ahsoka Tano, Barriss Offee and Nadar Veb are among the Jedi fending off the assault. Offee is critically wounded. Tano is injured and stunned. When Ventress attempts to execute the Togruta Padawan, Nadar intervenes and takes the blow, dying to save his comrade. Vale and clone reinforcements arrive, turning the tide. While Dooku and Say escape, the rest of the CIS forces are decimated. Vale engages Ventress and kills her. He also injures the leader of the attack in the Great Hall, however then he heals her and takes her as a prisoner. In time she will take the name of Ari Adu and become Vale's second apprentice. Mace Windu attempts to arrest Vale for being a Sith. He is dissuaded from that core of action by Yoda, who senses the hostility of the clone troopers present in the temple. A consequence of that attempt is that Windu is later stripped from his position as a Jedi Master and sent to the front lines attached to a commando unit. The aftermath of the Rand on Coruscant is profound. With Gar High Command had been crippled, a reform is implemented. Command of the Republic Armed Forces is officially divided in two branches: Direct Action Command in charge of all combat forces and Logistical Branch, taking over the rest. General Vale is given a promotion and, for all intents and purposes, becomes the Supreme Commander of the Republic's military. General Tella Valentra is promoted to take over the Logistics Branch. They implement reforms in the chain of command, which hits the Jedi generals hard. The Jedi commanders are evaluated, and only a third of them retain their ranks. The rest are demoted and put in charge of smaller formations according to their skills, or even placed into commando units. The effect of the reforms is soon felt as the Republic military becomes more effective as a result. The raid on Coruscant is universally condemned. Corellia changes its stance and begins covert negotiations with the Republic about joining the war effort. The Separatist cause takes another major hit. The liberation of Ryloth. This operation was General Vale's first real test after assuming command of GAR's combat branch. The operation is overall a resounding success, both in space and on the ground. Weaknesses in existing doctrine are identified and steps are taken to resolve them, something which will have a profound effect during the ground portion of Second Geonosis. The liberation is notable for its hit on the general population of the Republic. The discovery of Separatist attempts to sell large portion of the Twi'lek population into slavery to the Hutts enrages the Republic. Recruitment efforts strengthening after the raid on Coruscant soar. Corellia officially condemns the Confederacy's actions in the past few months and enters a military alliance with the Republic. Wat Tambor is captured on Ryloth and forced to give up his deactivation codes, which shut down the majority of the droid armies on the ground. As a consequence, the Confederacy stops adding hardwired shutdown command into its droid armies. The liberation of Ryloth was the first debut of the Guardian system, one of the weapons that changed the face of space warfare during the Clone Wars. Second Geonosis. This is General Vale's biggest test to date. Republic intelligence receives information that experimental droid factories would soon be completed on Geonosis, and that the planet has motley recovered after the first battle of the war which was waged there. The Confederacy heavily reinforces that world both on the ground and in space, daring the Republic to attack. General Vale receives authorization to eliminate the threat of the experimental Separatist weapons and neutralize Geonosis as a theat. To achieve those objectives, he assembles one of the largest single fleets seen since the beginning of the conflict, First Assault Fleet. Vale's plans for assaulting Geonosis are torn asunder when General Anakin Skywalker goes rogue and takes a dozen Venta cruisers in an ill-conceived attack upon the Separatist stronghold. While Skywalker caused an unexpectedly high amount of damage, his force is annihilated with only his flagship surviving long enough to crash land. After the Republic Navy secures the orbitals hours later, Skywalker is rescued along with any survivors. The Jedi Knight is then placed under arrest to await a trial. In response to Skywalker's stunt, General Vale is forced to attack before he is ready. He reveals his skills in the mythical technique of battle meditation, which tunnels the tide of the space battle for Geonosis. While First Assault Fleet suffers significant casualties, the Confederate presence beyond Geonosis orbit is eliminated within hours. Second Geonosis is notable for the first mass deployment of the Guardian system, which was vital in dealing with CIS vulture swarms. More new technologies were used in numbers on the ground, new weapons and armor along with a new method of orbital insertion, which was vital in securing the planetary shield generators and allowing significantly easier assault on the planet. A major change from previous GAR operations was the unrestrained use of orbital bombardment on any targets with military or dual use, including but not contained to spaceports, industrial centers, and logistic hubs. By the time Geonosis surrendered, its economy, industry, and transport networks were wrecked. Conservative estimates of the local civilian casualties due to the orbital strikes is in the hundreds of millions. More are estimated to die due to exposure and disruption in water, food and medicine distribution. The raid on Mandalore. After Geonosis, General Vale was dispatched to Mandalore to negotiate an alliance with Duchess Satine Kaiser's new Mandalorian government, which at the time was opposed by Pre Vizsla's Death Watch. Even now, months later, details are sparse. What is known for sure is that General Vale married Bo-Katan Kryze, the Duchess' sister, in a dual ceremony when Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi married Satine Kryze herself. Hours later, a Separatist fleet led by General Grievous, who had been freed by an unknown Pari, assaulted Mandalore. They were aided by Death Watch members who disabled the planetary shields. As a consequence, the capital city of Sundari and the surrounding area were bombarded by the Confederacy force, which was simultaneously engaging the Mandalorian Defense Fleet and Republic Task Force under the command of Commodore Gilad Pellaeon. The battle ended with the arrival of Republic reinforcements led by the Corellian cruiser Freedom commanded by Captain Joanna Holt. The end of the engagement saw the complete destruction of the Mandalorian Navy, Pellaeon's task force, and Grievous's fleet, though the Separatist general managed to make planetfall. In the aftermath, General Vale was elected as Mandalore. Meanwhile, General Kenobi led a strike team to recapture Grievous. The Jedi found the Separatist leader and engaged him in combat, which resulted in Grievous's death. At Trizia, Vale led a containment fleet to engage a sapient bioweapon, which resulted in the destruction of the world. What was made publicly available of that Crimson Strain's capabilities was intriguing. Note to self, put all information about Crimson on a separate file and send it to the Shapers as a high priority. Carefully contact agents and try procuring a sample if available. Gray glared at the cliff notes. This Vale character was concerning. The Intelligence Directorate had been glad when the Sith managed to get themselves finally killed off 1,000 years ago. No matter what the warrior cast, though, of the loss of such worthy enemies. Those lunatics were disgraced anyway. Their failure was the primary reason why the Vong had been forced to fundamentally change and run in order to survive. Jedi, Sith. Bah, couldn't all those bastards kill off each other and spare him the headache? 144, Chapter 35. Parts 5 and 6. Phase 35, The Lost Fleet, equals RK equals. Part 5, Republica Cincisute, Coruscant. Anakin nodded stiffly to the squad leader of the riot police unit stationed at his wife's floor to keep reporters and other crazies away, and got a cold acknowledgement in reply. Skywalker wondered if he'll ever see the day when most people he met wouldn't hold his action on Geonosis against him. Personally, he deemed the odds quite low. Skywalker got into the apartment he now openly shared with Padme and dragged himself to the fresher, before discarding his clothes and getting under a fan of hot water. The training regiment instituted by Obi-Wan to get him into shape was running Anakin ragged. At least he had leave to go home in the evening, which was heaven after his imprisonment. Skywalker smiled when he heard the front door open. A moment later, he was able to sense Padme's presence. The anger and resignation radiating from her wiped the smile off his face. Anakin finished his bath ASAP, got a robe from a nearby cupboard, and went to see his wife. "Tough day, love?" Skywalker asked when he entered the living room. Padme had collapsed on the couch and just groaned something unintelligible. Anakin went to sit next to his wife and pulled her into a hug. Her very presence made the stress and frustration which were his constant companions for months subdue. "I'm not fine," Padme grumbled. "We finally got news from home. A frigate made it to a holonet transmitter in Hutt space. The fleet was forced to go under the planetary shield. Multiple landing sites were confirmed before the connection was cut." "I'm sorry, I should be there," Anakin grumbled. "I need you here," Padme mumbled. "General Typho should have things handled. Everything I've been cleared to see indicates that the army is well trained, considering how new it is, and it's very well equipped. There are a lot of clones on Naboo, too." Anakin tried to reassure his wife. He pulled her closer and began running a hand through her hair in an attempt to calm her down. "Everything feels wrong," Padme grumbled. "We're peaceful people. We shouldn't be training armies and building war machines." Padme shook with the outrage she felt. "I know. Believe me, I know how wrong this whole madness feels. Anakin muttered. Padme gripped his left arm and shifted so she could look her husband in the eyes. Her gaze was heavy with emotions. "That's what my mind says," Padme whispered. A tear formed in the corners of her eyes. "It's no longer what I feel." Her words were a harsh whisper. Anakin nodded numbly. The anger rising in Padme's chest was like a beacon that called to him. Peace. A hollow laughter escaped her lips. What did it get us? 2 invasions and a poisoned world. Skywalker could practically taste his wife's indignation. Every word she uttered, every admission made her anger burn hotter. "Padme, what happened on Naboo isn't your fault," Anakin said. "Isn't it? I was the queen and did nothing but utter hollow protests before running away to beg the Senate for help. We all know how that turned out. Now I'm senator, and it took another invasion and the Separatists using a bioweapon on Naboo to open my eyes." "How isn't it my fault?" Padme snapped. "All you did was to stand up for your principles, love. That's something I admire in you, not something to be blamed for." Anakin did his best to calm down his wife. "Tell that to all the people who died from the Blue Shadow. Tell it to everyone who will die fighting off another invasion," Padme raged. "I will." Anakin simply nodded. Padme looked him in the eyes for a long moment and relaxed a bit. A small, fond smile appeared on her face. The anger and self-recrimination she was feeling subdued a bit. "I can't go on like this, Anakin," Padme muttered quietly. "I can't go on and keep telling people that there must be peace, that this war has to end in anything but the destruction of the Separatists." Her face hardened. "I want them to pay for all they did to my people. To us. To me," Padme admitted. Skywalker held her tighter and felt her anger mingle with mortification at that confession. There was something in her expression, in the emotions she radiated, that made him shiver and swell with desire. "I understand," Anakin whispered back. "I know how you feel, my love. I feel the same way. There is a part of me that needs to make the Separatists pay for all the pain they caused you. I need to make sure they won't be able to hurt you nor anyone else ever again. Those emotions go against everything I've been taught as a Jedi." Skywalker smiled sadly. "I don't really care. You're what matters, my love. I'll do everything in my power to make the Separatist pay for everything." Padme gazed in his eyes and smiled. There was no need to say anything else. They had an understanding, a pact. All the mortification and shame Padme felt melted away. They were replaced by determination and vindication. Her anger cooled down a bit and slowly turned into another kind of heat. Anakin smiled and leaned forward to capture Padme's lips in a searing kiss, which she returned eagerly. RK equals Industrial District, Sundari, Mandalore. 3 days of heavy fighting, 4 waves of enemy reinforcements, and almost total air superiority in the area was all it took for the Separatists to break through the defenses surrounding the capital and land forces through one of the still gaping holes in the dome supposed to protect Sundari from the desert. The droid armies paid in fields of war machines turned into scrap and rivers of oil for their achievement, however they did it. The defenses were breached, and the enemy began shuttling troops into the city. There were rumors about an armored force being assembled upseal the breach. However, Arya didn't put much trust in that idea. While the new and inexperienced Mandalorian armored formations did well when on the defense, they were mauled badly by airstrikes and Separatist armored thrusts. Astra was well aware of that fact. Omega Squad was sent more than once to take care of enemy infantry dropped behind the front lines, so she saw firsthand how the armored formations performed. On the other hand, most of the basilisks were kept in reserve until a good opportunity to use them decisively appeared. At least that's what the rumor mill said, according to Dev. For all Astra knew, the war droids might have attacked and been crushed already. "Omega, we're up," Nina shouted. "The AA in the industrial district is being suppressed, and the clankers are landing all over the place. We're moving ahead of 5th Sundari Regiment to slow down the enemy. Heavy reinforcements are 20 minutes behind us." "So much for getting a bit of shut-eye," Artin grumbled. "We got 4 hours off yesterday. I think—" Arya frowned. The last few days were already blurring together. "Get on the lat," Nina snapped and followed his own order. Arya and Omega squad piled into the transport and it shot in the air before diving to street level. It was joined by 5 more lats, loaded to the brim with heavy-armed and even more pissed-off Mandalorians. No one bothered sealing the side doors, which let Arya have a great view of the part of Sundari they were flying over. The streets below were blocked by makeshift barricades with the odd strongpoint properly built by combat engineers. The buildings on the both sides were being turned into fortresses by platoons of Mandalorian warriors. Soon enough, the QRF Omega was attached to reach the contested zone. Harsh sunlight poured through the breach in the dome, giving the industrial area a haunting beauty, which was broken by the flashes of firefights and explosions. Separatist assault transports and gunships were busy shooting up the defense perimeter surrounding the area around the breach, while others dashed in different directions to drop commando droids behind the defenders. "Hold on, we're almost at the LZ," the pilot shouted. The LAT accelerated even faster for a few seconds before getting to a jarring stop next to a wall surrounding a row of warehouse. "Go!" Nina shouted and jumped off the transport. Nearby, Mandalorians in heavy armor with jetpacks were simply hurling themselves off the LAATs before flying at the nearest enemies. In moments, heavy fighting erupted at the both flanks of the LZ. Arya shouldered the carbine she carried for mid-range work and to preserve her strength and scanned the area. Omega was covered by the wall for the time being, and there were no clankers in sight. "Arya, you're getting over first. Draw the enemy's attention. We're 5 seconds behind you," Nina ordered. The Sith in training nodded, put her gun on the magnetic clamp on her back, and got her lightsaber before simply using the Force to jump over the wall. A droid tried to shoot her while she was descending, however she was able to deflect its fire. The clanker was still attempting to gun her down when the clone used grappling hooks to scale the wall and shot the droid before getting on the other side. "Right flank," Nina ordered. Atin and Arya moved to secure the corner of the closest warehouse, and the rest of Omega followed. A Mandalorian flew above them and sent 2 missiles somewhere behind the next warehouse before diving away from a gunship that attempted to nail him. The Separatist machine froze in mid-air when a quartet of red beams speared through it, then promptly blew up. Arya glanced up and grinned when a basilisk flew overhead, searching for other targets. A minute later, Omega was sneaking up to the closest firefight. 2 squads of Mandalorians in painted clone armor had dug into the front of a warehouse and were ducking it with a platoon of SB and commando droids. The most of the machines were taking cover behind a ragged line of destroyed armor. Both CIS hover tanks and GAR provided walkers. "Throw smoke and we're flanking them before some of their friends turn up. Arya, you're on point. Fee, get on a higher ground and provide support. The rest form up on me," Nina ordered. 30 seconds later, the sniper had found a perch on top of a nearby warehouse. Omega threw 5 smoke grenades and charged the enemy after they detonated. The droids rallied faster than expected and threw grenades at the advancing commandos. Arya stopped them mid-air and returned them to the sender. 10 ragged explosions later, Omega fell upon the enemy flank and began dismantling what was left of the enemy platoon. Less than a minute later, it was all over. The defenders gave out ragged cheers, however the clones were already sprinting towards the next engagement. It was going to be another long day for Omega Squad. =RK=. Part 6. Bridge. Heavy Cruiser Warrior. High orbit above Ari Adu. "Our situation is deteriorating," Rear Admiral Niels Tennant said over the comm. The man's expression was a textbook example of grim determination mixed with weariness. Brigadier Gideon Tarkin, the man in charge of Ari Adu's own fleet and the forces he had built from the system defense navies of most notable worlds in the Siswena sector, nodded in acceptance. "I have another regiment embarking. They'll be on the moon in 4 hours, Tarkin said, for all the good it was going to do. "Thank you, Brigadier. If we lose the remaining cannons and the shield generator on the moon, we'll be done for." Tennant let out a relieved sigh. "Another regiment won't be enough to stop the Separatists. However, I don't dare pull out many more units. As of 2 hours ago, there are 3 droid army groups down on Eridau, and they're pressing hard towards the shield generators and the capital." Tarkin grimaced. "We lack acclimators able to land and lift off afterward to easily shift forces anyway. Only 2 of the assault ships in the system were still operational, and both were too heavily damaged to successfully land on the planet and then reach orbit. That left Tarkin relying on various shuttles in order to bring reinforcements and supplies to the moon. The Brigadier fixed his attention on the holotank, showing the remaining Republic forces in the system. With the exception of the combined fleets pinned in place between Ari Adu and her moon, there was a small task force playing tag with a much larger Separatist battle group in the asteroid rings of the system's single gas giant. Technically speaking, Tennant and Tarkin had a powerful force at their disposal, one that was further augmented by the remnants of 4 theater fleets. However, most of those ships were damaged to one degree or another during the 2-week-long siege that led to their unenviable position. If it wasn't for the anti-orbital cannons still operational on the moon and the multiple Golan platforms dragged around the shipyards in geostationary orbit between Ari Adu and its single natural satellite, the Loyalist would have been overwhelmed days ago. Even with those defensive advantages, only the presence of 2 gravity well generators completely locking up any attempt for hyperspace insertion in the middle of the pocket, where the Republic forces were gathered, prevented the enemy from successfully implementing its favorite ramming attacks. In the end, everything the Tarkin brothers and their extended family did, all the preparations they made in the build-up to this inevitable war, only meant that he was losing the battle for his homeworld slower. Ever since the enemy offensive began, Eridau had acquired a ring of destroyed ships, dead men and broken droids, which was a testament for the ferocity with which both sides fought. Despite heavy losses, the Confederacy continued to feed more material in the assault. The enemy simply had to remove Ari Adu as a threat. The system was strategically placed to threaten multiple sectors and was at a crossroad of multiple hyperspace lanes. Taking Tarkin's world was going to tear out the heart of the whole Siswena sector, which would then fall relatively easy. That was a foregone conclusion when most of the system defense navies were here as a part of the theater fleets created by Gideon. The idea for drawing the bulk of the enemy forces hitting the sector to Ari Adu by making the system a staging ground for raids in Separatist space has been his. Tarkin knew his world would be assaulted anyway, and this way he not only had a better chance to hold it, but he was going to spare the other worlds he was responsible for. That was the plan. Unfortunately, it overlooked the sheer magnitude of the forces the Confederacy could bring to bear against the Republic in this grand offensive of theirs. It was a small miracle that instead of throwing more ships at Ari Adu, the Separatist had decided to spend most of a sector fleet to lock down the whole western quadrant. Otherwise, the fact that 2/3 of the Republic sector fleet meant to protect that same territory wasn't here at Ari Adu would have proven fatal. On the other hand, even their presence wasn't a magic solution. If Tennant's whole command was present, the same would be true for the enemy too, and the overall correlation of the forces would be roughly the same anyway. The Separatists are forming up for another attack, Tennant spoke quietly. Tarkin frowned. If he was in their shoes, Gideon would have waited for the droid army on the moon to crack the defenses there and take out either the cannons or the shield. Attacking while that firepower was still available was going to be expensive and likely futile. The Separatist had tried it multiple times anyway, and there was no indication it was going to work. That's weird. Tarkin's frown deepened. The symbols representing the enemy fleets boxing in the Loyalists were shifting all right, however only 1/3 of them were assuming an offensive formations aimed at his forces. The rest were assuming defensive formations and maneuvering to face away from Ari Adu. Brigadier, the enemy forces on the moon are starting another assault. Tarkin's liaison with the infantry informed him. Tell them to hold at all cost. Reinforcements will be arriving in a few hours. Gideon spoke absent-mindedly. Despite all the ECM thrown away by the Separatists, the Republic forces had no trouble detecting a decent-sized fleet exiting hyperspace a light hour from Ari Adu. There were a lot of powerful scanners still operation on the moon and in the orbital segment under Loyalist control. The newcomers were obviously more Separatist, probably called back from securing the rest of the quadrant. However, that didn't explain the enemy's actions. The Confederate forces appeared to be preparing to fend off attack, and not one coming from Tarkin's or Tennant's fleets. Sir, we're getting a lot of encrypted traffic between the newcomers and the enemy flagship. There's too much interference to get much of it. We're dumping the raw data to Intel for decryption and analysis, a member of Takrin's staff reported. They're either putting an elaborate show for us, or Vale put a spanner in their plans. He should be getting to the staging areas at this time. Perhaps a few days earlier if he was lucky in the unknown regions. Tennant chuckled. That would certainly explain it. Tarkin nodded. It won't matter if the good general's coming to relieve us if we aren't here when he arrives, Gideon added. I concur, Niels agreed. We'll just have to hold the line no matter what. Equals RK equals. Second Platoon, Black Company, 41st Battalion, the Grim Reapers, Ari Adu's moon. Dex, get on the comm. We need air resupply, Sergeant Hound growled. The senior NCO was once again in charge of the whole platoon after the newest lieutenant managed to get himself killed last week. Fighting on the mostly airless ball of rock reminded Hound of Geonosis, with more droids, less bugs, and no air to breathe. After just a week of R&R, the whole division had been hurried to Ari Adu and ordered go hold the world at all costs. That, in turn, meant that they got thrown in the hottest fires, thanks to the simple fact that they were one of the few units in the system fully equipped with the new weapons and armor. The former proved invaluable in holding the moon so far, because in that environment, even an otherwise non-lethal glance could prove fatal. Things like the running-out air supply of the platoon might very well kill them all before the clankers could. I'm on it, Sarge, Dex shouted back. Hound nodded in satisfaction and returned his attention to commanding. He was actually beginning to miss that competent Jedi who took command back on Geonosis. They sure could use a few of the blighters. We've got droidekas, a KNG, criffing new guy, from the local company helping hold the valley leading to the ion cannon shouted. Heavy 3, you're cleared to engage. Blue and red fire teams provide support. Hound ordered after examining the situation. 20 or so of the destroyer droids had come uncomfortably close after being screened by a battalion of B-1s sent out to soak up the incoming fire. The blighters actually managed to deploy and activate their shields before coming under effective fire, and only one was disabled before it could be surrounded by its defense field. The droidekas laid down suppressive fire, which in turn allowed 2 SB companies to advance without too much trouble. In the evening twilight, the firefight looked like something from a demented dream. The thin atmosphere was just the right composition and thick enough to make each shot appear as a much larger glowing bolt of fiery plasma moments after leaving the barrel of a gun. It was almost beautiful in a macabre sort of way. Black 1 to Black Actual, I need a fire mission at the following coordinates, Hound called command. Black Actual, Black 1, that's negative. All supports is engaged to capacity. Hold your ground, over. Copy that, Black Actual. The sergeant added a few quiet curses. Rock, bring in the reserve on the right flank, Hound ordered, before cursing again. The sergeant activated the zoom function built in his helmet and grit his teeth. An armor column was heading straight at the valley's entrance. It was screened by 10 speeder-mounted B-1s and followed by what looked suspiciously like a battalion worth of mechanized infantry mounted in APCs. Black 1 to Black Actual, be advised I have visual on heavy enemy forces moving our way. ETA 8 minutes. We need all the support you can get to us. Black Actual, Black 1, stand by. Dispatching reserves to your position. Over. Black 1, Black Actual, roger. Over. Hound grunted. Those reinforcements better hurry or they would be running right into a clanker armored spearhead. The sergeant glanced around. The only thing he had left was his command squad. Dex, make sure we get our criffing air and call in all the artillery support that becomes available. The rest of you boys, come with me. We have some uninvited guests to kick out. Hound ordered and began advancing to the right flank, where his heavy weapon specialists were laying down the pain upon those droidekas. 145th. Chapter 35, Interlude and Part 7. Interlude, Shadowfeed 1, equals RK equals. Shadowfeed Studio, Raxalon City, Raxus. Good morning to you all, citizens of the Confederacy. I'm Ryloth Racer, and today I want to welcome you all with our first broadcast from Raxus. A blue Twi'lek woman exclaimed. Her face was hidden by strategically placed shadows, however her voice was no trillion, both in the Confederacy and the Republic. Good morning, Raxus. I'm Ul Haber, and today we bring you the truth about the war from the center of the free galaxy. An apparently human male whose face was hidden too displayed his exuberance for the whole galaxy to see. Let's start with the topic we at Shadowfeed know is on the minds of you all: the sudden change of leadership in the Confederacy. Everyone watching could feel that Risa was beaming at the cameras. We've been diligently investigating for months before finding out the truth. Indeed, Ryloth, Ul added cheerfully. The results of our investigation are ready, and they're why we took the radical step of moving here to Raxus. We at Shadowfeed are glad to dispel some of your fears. He added in a more somber tone, it's regrettable that our agents were able to confirm others. Risa could be seen nodding in the shadows. The former leader of the Confederacy, Count Dooku, was arrested under suspicions that he was a Sith Lord. The Twi'lek said, that came as a shock to many. After all, he's been saying for years that the Republic had fallen under Sith control and the Confederacy was the one true hope for freedom in the galaxy. I'm afraid to report that we were masterfully deceived, Haber spoke in a sad tone. Among Count Dooku's personal items seized after his arrest were documents and journals proving that he is indeed a Sith Lord. Even more concerning, he often speaks of a master who is highly placed within the Republic. We're making the documents our agents managed to copy available to you all to see. Risa waved a hand and multiple windows appeared around the anchors. At this time, it's our best guess that the Clone Wars were engineered by the Sith so they could seize control of the Republic and crush the freedom-loving people of the Outer Rim and those supporting the cause of real democracy and freedom across the galaxy. The sudden appearance of the Republic General Vale, who freely admits that he's a Sith, and his war crimes lends further credence to that theory. Haber continued, the most damning revelations about Count Dooku are fragmented orders retrieved by Confederate slicers, confirming that he gave the orders for unleashing the bioweapon Blue Shadow on both Naboo and Coruscant. Further, it was under his direction that the peace conference on Cato Ne Modia was sabotaged and Republic Senator Padme Skywalker grievously wounded. The betrayal by that Sith runs deeper. Our agents recovered data confirming that he persuaded Wat Tambor, the former leader of the Techno Union, to make a deal with certain criminal elements in Hutt space so they could make the Confederacy complicit in the enslavement of millions of peaceful Ryloth citizens. Risa's rightful indignation shone through her words. After Dooku's guilt was proven, the Confederacy Council made the decision to attempt to end this war one last time so we could foil the Sith's plan. Ul continued. Count Dooku was handed to a Republic naval battle group under the command of Jedi Master Ram Kota more than a month ago so he can be put on trial for his crimes against all free sentient beings in the galaxy. Haber paused. We heard nothing from the Republic since then. Attempts from Confederate diplomats to open talks were rebuffed. Everything our agents could gather and all our sources in the Confederate government agree with one regrettable truth. The Republic appears to have fallen under the control of the Sith. It's unclear how many of the Jedi followed suit, like the former Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was placed in charge of the Republic armed forces. Risa took up the narrative. This is why the offensive currently carried out by Confederate forces across the galaxy was approved. There could be no peace, no freedom, while the Republic is under the control of power-hungry, warmongering Sith. We all saw what means to lose when the Sith are in charge. Geonosis is a testament for the Sith's brutality and cruelty. Even now, more than 2 months after that world fell to Republic forces, led by the Sith Lord Delcatar Vale, the civilian casualty count is being updated. Haber reminded the viewers, under the Sith, the Republic threw away all conventions of civilized warfare and wantonly bombarded civilian targets, leading to more than 400 million of non-combatant casualties to date. Yet, when General Grievous was sent to Mandalore to bring Vale to justice and execute a lawful reprisal against strictly military targets, mind you, he was captured and summary executed by Vale's ally Obi-Wan Kenobi. Even now, Republic propaganda is busy tarnishing the image of one of the Confederacy's most successful military leaders while singing praises to their own pet butcher. Risa exclaimed, full of righteous indignation. Fear not, Haber announced. The days of the Sith and their pawns are numbered. As we speak, fleets led by the Confederacy's finest military minds liberate large parts of the galaxy. Forces under the command of Admiral Kirst are assaulting Camino as we speak, so they can capture the source of endless Republic manpower. Other Confederate forces fight valiantly to liberate Mandalore and all peaceful new Mandalorians from the war clique led by Vale, who took power after a coup following General Grievous' attempt to arrest the war criminal. Risa added, "We can confirm another news that has been on the minds of many. Duro finally surrendered to Confederate forces under the command of Admiral Trench. The system is being fortified against Republic reprisals, and efforts are underway to eradicate Sith influence among the Duro's government. Meanwhile, Admiral Duaningo finally broke the fanatical Republic resistance at Antar and is consolidating his forces before pushing further into the core." Haber continued, "RK equals. With the galaxy set aflame by the actions of the Sith, many citizens wonder why we fight." Risa continued after the summary of the current military situation was over. "It's an important question. Why the people of the Outer and Inner Rim should fight, sacrifice and die to save a decadent and corrupt republic from its just reward." Haber nodded emphatically. "The answer is simple and regrettable. There is no other choice for any freedom-loving being in the galaxy. We all know the history of the Sith, even if the details had fallen out of favor in many history classes. While we'll be running a special editorial about the history of the Sith later this week, the high points are obvious to us all. They become crystal clear when we examine the actions of Dooku and Vale, the two Sith we know for certain exist," Risa explained. "Wanton, senseless destruction, war crimes, slavery. Those are among their sins. How long before they announce that the Republic is no more and openly replace it with an empire? How long before they stir the gullible into a frenzy and persuade them that everything that's wrong in the core worlds and the inner colonies is the fault of the peaceful people here in the Outer Rim? I ask you, how long before they come to put a Durasteel boot on our backs because we dare defy them?" Haber exclaimed. "If given the chance, tomorrow." Risa answered the rhetorical question. "We've been showing the galaxy the truth for months now, bringing Republic propaganda, lies and crimes into the light. We've been doing the same when misguided elements in the Confederacy committed crimes in an attempt to retaliate for the GAR's atrocities. The sad truth is that there could be no peace while the Sith control the Republic. If the Confederacy does anything less than its best to achieve a total victory, it would be betraying not only the ideals it was built upon, but condemning every one of its citizens to life under Sith rule. Our few remaining agents on Mandalore showed us all what happens with those who oppose the Sith," Haber said. "The Death Watch organization, whose only crime was to wish a reform that kept their traditions alive and to support the Confederacy in its defiance of the Sith-led Republic, had been outlawed and its members hunted down like rabid crathhounds. That's what awaits us all if the Republic is allowed to triumph. Every free-minded individual in the galaxy would be labeled a dissident and hunted down for daring oppose tyranny." Phase 35, The Lost Fleet, RK equals. Part 7, Bridge, Mon Calamari Star Cruiser Liberty. Mon Cala system. This wasn't his place, Jial Akbar thought. He should be back under the oceans of the homeworld with his prince. Instead, like a good guard captain, Akbar followed the orders he had been given. "How long, Captain Rowe?" Akbar asked the chief engineer in charge of retrofitting the Liberty into a warship. The much older Mon Calamari looked up from a datapad he was studying and blinked at the interruption. "We're running out of time," Jial pressed on. "The Republic fleet won't be able to keep the enemy off our backs for much longer, and the capital might fall within days. We need this ship ready to fight his way to friendly space with as many people we can cram on board." Akbar continued. "How long?" he asked again. "The primary shield systems are good. We still have problem with the secondary emitters interfering with each other and scrambling targeting scanners along the broadside. While half of the turbo lasers and ion cannons are installed and ready for testing, we're only 30% done with the Guardian." "We need more time," Rowe exclaimed. "That's the one resource no one can give any of us, Chief Engineer." "How will the Liberty stand up to Separatist frigates? To a battleship?" Akbar sighed. "Oh, that." Rowe tilted its head in confusion. "Why didn't you say so?" Once we resolve the interference issues, she'll be able to take on a battleship or two, even with the limited armaments we've been able to install. Akbar felt like strangling the engineer. Get it solved then. The first evacuees will be arriving tomorrow morning. We'll likely be carrying what's left of the royal family too, so for all our sakes, I hope that you're right. We'll have to fight our way to friendly space, Gial said. Akbar dismissed the engineer, made his way to the comm station and contacted the royal palace. Soon the captain was looking at the tired, youthful face of Prince Li Cha, the heir of the Dak throne. The young royal wore a crumpled blue uniform with only the few medals he had earned during the fighting when he got too foolhardy and actually led from the front to prove his bravery. Fortunately, Gial and the rest of the guard managed to keep their charge alive. At least the boy more or less knew how to handle himself in a scrap. Captain Akbar, it's good to see you. Li Cha smiled tiredly. I hope you have good news. We can use some. The Liberty will be ready soon, my prince, Akbar said. Good. Li Cha's stiff posture relaxed a bit. We won't be able to hold for much longer. General Fisto took our remaining reserves out to slow down the enemy advance. The best estimates are that in 2 days, the capital's defenses will be breached. The prince looked at the floor. If we're lucky. The situation up here isn't much better. The navy is hard-pressed. I have to report that most of the refits won't be completed in time. At best, we can count on another partially armed star cruiser. The good news is that the others will have their shield systems mostly operational. We should be able to evacuate a lot of civilians. Akbar hoped so anyway. Getting all those people to the ships and then to safety was going to be anything but trivial. I'm glad to hear it, Captain Akbar. The prince smiled. I'll organize the evacuation. We'll get out everyone we can before the capital falls. RK . Coral City outskirts. Mon Cala. Kit Fisto was in his elements. The cool ocean water slid around him as he swam forward, leading hundreds of clones and Mon Cala into battle. The Jedi Master wished he had the time to appreciate the beautiful reef surrounding the capital before they were ruined by the battle. However, he knew that it was a wishful thinking. In front of him, tens of thousands, both flesh and blood soldiers and droids, were busy dying. Fist could feel the battle even before his eyes could see the wild melee. He waved forward and activated his lightsaber. It was time to fight and die to buy time for the civilians in Coral City to evacuate. The Jedi Master had no illusions about the ultimate outcome of the battle. The clones, while doing their best, simply lacked sufficient training in underwater combat to counter the warriors of a species evolved to fight in such an environment. There was not enough training in the whole galaxy to make up for the natural advantage an aquatic species had in the heart of their domain. Nor the Gar soldiers could properly counter the new variety of droids meant for underwater combat deployed in massive numbers by the Separatists. While the Mon Cala could hold their ground against the best the enemy had, the sad fact was that there weren't enough of them. Fisto knew of plans to get the Gungan's Grand Army as reinforcements when fighting on water worlds. However, the Blue Shadow hit them hard, and they were still under quarantine anyway. Besides, with the planet cut off from Republic space, reinforcements couldn't reach them in time anyway. That left fighting a desperate holding action, and Fisto was all right with that. He was doing his duty as a Jedi, protecting the innocents against those wishing them harm. Kit finally reached the edge of the raging battle and used the Force to make himself even more maneuverable by all but eliminating friction. The Jedi Master danced through the water, shifting away from blaster fire and harpoon darts. A Quarren tried to bite him with his fang-like teeth and most of its face tentacles for his trouble before Fisto swam away. He headed straight towards a group of droids content to provide fire support for their allies. The Jedi Master let the Force guide his actions, and in less than a minute, he was heading away from a bunch of debris falling to the ocean floor. For a moment, he found himself away from the enemy and used it to examine the effect his reinforcements had on the battle. Fisto was glad to see that the Quarren and Separatist forces were faltering. One more hard push, and they might break to regroup, thus buying more time for the defenders. Kit looked for any commanders and soon saw a small group surrounded by heavy escort. He smiled and swam their way, using a nearby coral reef for cover. Fisto dispatched the few enemies that got his way, then gave a signal to a clone platoon that was supposed to be following him, and in fact had been able to more or less keep up with him. A minute later, the soldiers were in position, and they swam at the enemy leaders. The escort saw them coming, and most of it peeled away to face the danger. Kit smiled and dashed at the officer when he was sure he'll reach them before their protectors can turn back. Not that the clones were going to let them do so. A hail of blaster bolts and harpoon darts came his way from the remaining bodyguards. Fisto gave them a teeth-filled grin and raised his free hand in front of him, using the gesture as to aid him in controlling all the force he was channeling. A wave of telekinetic power flew in front of him, supercavitating the water and obscuring him from vision by creating thousands of bubbles. Both darts and blaster bolts were throw-off target by the effect. Moments later, the enemy group was scattered in all directions, and then the Jedi was upon them. Most died before they could recover, with just a handful putting any resistance before falling to Fisto's blade. Kit searched for other targets, and his grin grew. The enemy was attempting to disengage. He was going to oblige them, soon. But first, reducing their number on the cheap sounded like a good idea to the Republic general. He gave the order for a limited pursuit and headed for the closest concentration of Separatist forces. Fisto only hoped that this victory, no matter how temporarily, was going to buy enough time. RK equals 2nd Platoon, Black Company, 41st Battalion, the Grim Reapers. Ari Adu's moon. The reinforcements came almost in time. The same was true for the bit of artillery support the platoon received. That was cold comfort for Sergeant Hound. The local company 2nd Platoon has been attached to was simply gone. To their credit, the Ari Aduian soldiers didn't falter, nor break. They knew what was at stake. They held their ground when the armored spearhead struck. They died well. The same could be said for Hound's brothers. "Go, Sarge! We'll cover you!" Alec shouted over the comm. Hound's head snapped up and his heart stilled. The remaining heavy weapon specialists advanced towards the enemy, unleashing every single weapon in their disposal. 2nd Platoon, pull back now. On the double, Hound roared. He paused for a moment to salute Alec and began following his own order. As he ran, Hound glanced back every few paces. What he saw was going to be carved in his memory till his dying day. The overran forward trenches were a solid wall of fire as grenades and thermal detonators were spent like piss in the wind. The enemy tanks who led the charge went up one after another after being struck by missiles or portable laser cannons carried by troopers in heavy armor. The Separatist advance faltered at the sudden counterattack. For a heartbeat, Hound hoped that it would be enough, that Alex stood a chance after all. He jumped over a boulder, and when he glanced back again, reality simply had to rear up its ugly head. The heavy troopers ran out of explosives and the enemy rallied. Hundreds of droids surged over the forward trenches, followed by more tanks and APCs. Hound cursed the whole criffing galaxy and ran faster. He could see too damn few of his platoon doing the same. Most were either already dead or with Alec. When the sergeant looked back for one last time, he saw his buddy spear a tank with an overcharged shot from his laser cannon. The front of the armored machine blew out, and it lurched to a halt before something inside cooked off, and its turret was sent to the sky from a secondary explosion. The return fire came in enough volume to make a whole regiment proud and was deadly accurate. Alec vanished under a rain of blaster bolts that seemingly made the thin gas passing for atmosphere ignite around him. Then multiple tanks acquired his position and let loose with laser cannons and missiles. Hound knew that there wouldn't be enough left of his friend to bury. All he wanted then and there was to turn around and tear the droids with his bare hand. Instead, the clone cursed again and kept sprinting to the next and last defensive line just behind the edge of the shield, keeping the ion cannon safe from bombardment. If that defense was breached, the clankers would be able to take out the weapon, and that couldn't be allowed. The sergeant was almost at the bunkers where a battalion was arriving to reinforce the two local platoons stationed there when the Separatist tanks finally got through the abandoned defenses behind him and opened fire. Hound screamed when one after another his remaining brothers were picked up by cannon fire. Even their advanced armor couldn't take such firepower, and most of them were still in the open. A trooper got under the safety of the shield, then another. In turn, two more were blown to pieces. "Come, Dex reached the bunkers and turned back to wave at them. "There's a fire mission incoming." Hounds was already pushing himself as fast as he could. He could hear artillery shells slice through the thin atmosphere as they descended. Almost there. More of his brothers made it. Something detonated behind the sergeant, and the shockwave was enough to propel him through the shield. He landed hard and grunted in pain. His vision swam, however. Hound was aware enough to see the end of the flight. Rock and Blue Squad were in the rear, carrying a few wounded with them. Artillery shells began landing among the abandoned positions, and the droids swarming them, sending shockwaves and shrapnel in all directions. A tank was hit in the cupola and blew up when the thin armor was penetrated and the warhead detonated inside. Mac, who was carrying a wounded comrade, passed through the shield. Ken was next, and Rock was following a step behind when he was replaced by a flash of light. Hound blinked the white spots away from his vision and let out an incoherent scream. Rock was gone. Somehow only a single smoking boot was left where he stood. 146. Chapter 35, Parts 8 to 10. Phase 35, The Lost Fleet, equals RK equals. Part 8. Bridge, Heavy Cruiser Warrior, high orbit above Ari Adu. I guess Vale's still some time away. Admiral Tennant grumbled over the communication. Tarkin snorted. That became painfully obvious a few hours after the enemy reinforcements arrived. Gideon still had no idea what news they brought. However, after taking some time to digest it, the Confederate commander had decided it was finally time to secure the system for good. Most of the Separatist forces around Ari Adu had shifted their positions and assumed offensive formations in a circle around the Loyalists, and were now advancing. At the same time, the droids on the moon were throwing everything they had against the cannons. There were points where the fighting had reached the last defensive lines, and even rushing all available reserves there, the soldiers weren't expected to hold for long. In an hour, another regiment would be getting there from Ari Adu, and that would be the last force that could be spared from the planet. Deploy all remaining fighters and bombers. Let them use the wrecks as cover until the enemy comes close, Tarkin ordered. I want the tugs ready to maneuver the improvised platforms when necessary. Those were little more than hulks tractored in to provide some cover before a bright engineer had the great idea to either partially restore them or just slap on some light guns, shields, and missile pods to give them a bit of punch. Already doing it, Tennant said. The mine layers are deploying everything they have left too. The enemy is advancing, a sensor operator reported. The tactical plot changed to show hundreds of red dots moving towards the Loyalists. Authorizing the last of the weapon platforms to go activate. Good luck, Tarkin. Tennant saluted. Let's make our own. Try not to die. You're a decent sort for someone from the Corps. Gideon cracked a small smile before cutting off the feed. Comms, I need to talk with all the theater fleet commanders. Patching you through, Brigadier. 4 tired faces appeared in front of Gideon. 2 older humans, a man and woman, a Zabrak and a Bith, all wearing admiral uniforms from their respective system defense navies. We all know the score, so I won't be making any grand speeches. If we fall, our whole sector falls with us. The enemy comes, so let's kill the rusty bastards. Gideon's smile was all teeth. 1st and 2nd Fleet take the flanks. My own will hold the center. 3rd and 4th take those coming from above and below, respectively. The Republic Navy has our backs. Tarkin looked back at the tactical display. Nearly 400 munificents led the charge, followed by 200 recusant destroyers, and the battleships come behind them. The frigates came at flank speed and didn't appear to intend stopping until ramming something or passing through the Loyalist formation. This was going to be unpleasant. The enemy was first engaged by the cannons on the moon. Massive ion bolts turned munificents into dumb projectiles. Hypervelocity slugs battered aside particle shields and chewed through the lightly armored frigates. Then the single surviving turbolaser cannon spoke, and its first burst turned a munificent into little more than glowing space debris. The various weapons bolted on the wrecks surrounding the Republic forces spoke next. Couple of thousands concussion missiles were launched aimed at mere 10 frigates, while laser cannons and the odd turbo laser on, or even a couple of railguns, spread their love in an attempt to cripple as many of the incoming enemies as possible. The Umbrella did its best. The light screen of vultures deployed with the munificence flew to intercept the incoming ordnance too. Two munificents died when the missiles changed their attack vectors at the last possible moment, with another receiving moderate damage. A wave of return fire tore apart the first line of defense and further cluttered the battlefield with even more debris. Finally, the Separatist entered extreme range and began trading shots with the Loyalist forces. Within minutes, an ever-shrinking ring of fire appeared between Ari Adu and her moon. Reform the right flank. 3rd and 4th Theatre Fleets begin falling back at 10% reverse thrust. In 2 minutes, the rest of the fleets do the same at 25%. Continue crippling the munificents and retarget either when they fall out of formation or when their maneuverability is compromised, Tarkin ordered. The long-range engagement against the enemy escorts favored the Republic forces so far, however that segment of the battle was almost over. The frigates were coming uncomfortably close, and the light destroyers nipped on their heels. Once all of those properly mixed up, the battleships would come to mop up at their convenience and in relative safety. The price was going to be high. Unfortunately, if the enemy was willing to pay it all, Gideon could do was to make it even steeper. A few minutes and a lot of crippled and destroyed ships later, the range had fallen significantly. Soon, the munificents would be free to execute their ramming run. All small craft are clear to engage. Tenant ordered fleet-wide. All remaining weapon platforms are released to fire on the approaching frigates. And just like that, Tarkin became a spectator. There were no reserves left to deploy, no place left for any clever maneuvers. The Republic fleet had to fight and die, nested into the small protected space between Ari Adu and her moon. RK equals 71st Bomber Squadron, high orbit above Ari Adu. Just a few short months ago, Lieutenant Falk thought that Geonosis had been a chaotic storm of death and destruction that wouldn't be equaled anytime soon. 2 weeks of fighting to keep Ari Adu from the Separatists' clutches showed the error of his way. The clone believed that the losses at Geonosis had been bad. This never sufficiently criffed-up place gleefully proved him wrong again. Falk had the dubious honor to be the only one left still alive from the original 71st Squadron. Everyone who had made it through the cauldron that was Geonosis died above Ari Adu. Even worse, their replacements died too, twice. The 71st was practically in its 3rd iteration by now, and it was chock full with KNGs who Falk really didn't bother to know besides the bare minimum needed for administrative duties. It didn't matter really. They were all going to die too, and he was a dead man flying on borrowed time anyway. Fighting through vulture swarms since the war began to reach the Clankers' motherships had been bad enough. The new systems introduced by both sides, those criffing Guardians and Umbrellas, were the death knell of small craft everywhere. Only Command either didn't know it yet or didn't care because they kept throwing fighters and bombers in the fire for small gain. Revenant Actual, your weapons free. Target any munificent that you can. Overlord out. Falk twitched when he heard his new call sign, which he got after the 71st was all but destroyed for the 2nd time. Some REMF obviously decided that it was either funny or it would raise morale. The reminder that he should be dead like his brothers did neither. Revenant Flight, Revenant Actual, we're free to hunt. Keep a nice solid hulk between ourselves and the enemy until we can execute an attack run. Falk paused. Try not to die, he added, though the clone doubted it was going to help. The lieutenant looked up through the canopy. There was so much firepower concentrated in a relatively small space that a literal downpour of turbo laser bolts going every which way was visible with the naked eye. Falk shook his head. It would be a miracle if he made it through the next hour. He found he didn't really care. Today, tomorrow. It didn't matter. All clone pilots were on borrowed time anyway. Falk's scanners pinged, and he smiled grimly. Once more into the breach and all that bantha pudo. We've got incoming targets. Form up on me. We're pouncing on them when they pass by the hulk. We go in, unleash our torpedoes, then scatter and go back to the nest to rearm, the lieutenant ordered. Falk stared intently at his scanners. Every moment now. Follow me. He snapped over the comm and went immediately to Afterburner. His Y-wing accelerated past the battered wreck of the Venator in which Shadow the 71st was hiding. Two munificents flew past the destroyed engines of the Star Destroyer, and the bomber squadron flew straight behind them. A few weapon platforms, which were playing dead until now, went active and sent 20 missiles apiece at each of the frigates, along with a lot of blaster bolts. Falk grinned savagely when his targeting computer sounded a positive tone, and he pressed the firing button. The arc behind the engines was where the umbrella had the least coverage. It was meant to be covered by other ships or vultures, and right then and there, those weren't in any position to assist. However, a comparatively lighter defensive fire didn't mean it was non-existent or ineffective. A Y-wing blew up, then another. A third was clipped and spun out of control before slamming into the front third of a destroyed light cruisers. Finally, the torpedoes were away, and Falk made a sharp turn towards the burned-out hulk of a Lucca Hulk, which had been dragged to serve as an improvised shield for an orbital shipyard. Warning tones screamed in the cockpit, announcing that multiple missiles had locked on the lieutenant's bomber and were approaching fast. Falk cursed and began releasing decoys before sharply diving straight towards the wreck. A chocked scream came over the comm, and another newbie died. The clone was barely able to pull back before splattering over the torn armor of the Lucca Hulk. Most of the missiles weren't so fortunate and slammed into the ship. Two somehow managed to turn and follow him. Falk banked left and began weaving dangerously close, though a field of twisted cannon emplacements. One missile clipped the half-melted barrel of a turbo laser, yet the other persisted, and it was coming closer and closer. Falk pulled up, then dived sharply and turned around to fly into the cavernous hold of the battleship. The Criffing missile continued to follow. Floating debris, including large pieces of disabling droids, began bouncing off the fighter. Falk was barely able to see where he was flying and had to rely on his instruments alone. A proximity alarm roared in his ears, and he cut the engines, then went for a crash landing, just in time to avoid ramming a bunch of tanks floating in the vacuum. The missile's luck finally ran out, and in slammed into one of the armored vehicles. The blast wave was enough to throw the rest around, and one hit the port engine at the precisely wrong angle and speed, disabling it. Falk just stared in the darkness for the next few minutes, unable to believe that he was still alive. By all rights, he should have bought it and joined his brother in whatever passed for afterlife, if such a thing existed. The clone shook his head in exasperation. Why the criff was he still alive when so many good men didn't make it? RK equals. Part 9 equals RK equals. 2nd Platoon, Black Company, 41st Battalion, the Grim Reapers. Ari Adu's moon. Sarge, Dex shouted. Hound barely heard him over the scream of artillery shells and the constant cacophony of explosions. Even with a fresh battalion sent to hold the line, the only reason why the clankers hadn't reached the ion cannon behind them was the constant bombardment. What? The sergeant asked before wincing. The barrage tapered out and soon ended. Hound went to one of the monitors, showing what was happening outside the bunker, and began cursing. While the valley was turned into a hellscape of craters and twisted metal, the enemy was still pressing through. They sacrificed whole regiments of B-1s, used as little more than cannon fodder, and it apparently worked. Hound could see more tank approaching, this time escorted by commandos, SBs, and some new hulking droids that had a lot of big guns built in. The artillery is running short on shells, Sarge, Dex explained. We can't call for orbital support either, the fleet is fully engaged. From what I heard, they might be losing too. They was come out as a whisper. Criff it all. Are there any reserves left? Hound cursed again. Another regiment managed to land before things up there got totally criffed up. We should be getting at least one company. Dex pointed at the ceiling. Keep calling for more support. We're going to need all the help we could get. Hound clapped his brother's shoulder. Heavy laser cannons and repeaters, built in the bunkers, opened up on the advancing enemy. They answered with a barrage of smoke grenade that covered the whole valley in a silver metallic mist that cut visibility to just a few meters and scrambled all but the seismic sensors. Why did they send the competent clankers at us? Dex whined. Because we're that big pain in their metal arses. Get me all the support you can. Hound triggered his comm. This is Black 2 actual. I need all indirect fire support shooting at pre-designated coordinates. At least the company's integrated mortar section had some rounds left. Not enough to make big difference, but the shockwaves might clear up the smoke temporarily so the cannons could bag a few tanks before more could be applied. Hound smiled when the telltale flashes of thermal warheads lit up the silver mist and either burned it out or scattered it. The cannons wasted no time in retargeting and slagging the leading Separatist tanks before more smoke grenades were utilized by the enemy. The clankers were already a third up the valley and coming in fast. Hound gave the readjusted coordinates to the mortars 2 more times before they ran out of ammo. "Well, Criff," the sergeant summarized. The enemy was almost at the edge of the shield. He went to a nearby console and flipped open the transparent lid of a red button, then waited for the first group of tanks and infantry to pass through. They were met by withering amount of firepower, and most were slagged before they could send back more than a shot or two. A few survived long enough to shoot more of the smoke grenades, further obscuring the battlefield. Hound waited for a few more seconds and pressed the button. Dozens of charges placed just behind the edge of the shield detonated. It was a mix of high explosive packs and ion grenades. They were carefully crafted to expend most of their fury in a cone aimed at the enemy most likely approaches. The resulting thunderclap and pyrotechnics, thanks to the weird stuff passing for atmosphere, were quite impressive too. Hopefully that would make the clankers pause. Or not. Hulking figures surrounded by glowing shields came striding through the aftermath of the explosion. Automatic dispensers liberally sent grenades, smoke and otherwise, everywhere. Shoulder-mounted cannons tracked the nearest bunkers and sent eye-watering lances of white light at them, followed by missile barrages. Scores of repeater bolts slammed in their shields and had seemingly the same effect as water drops hitting the surface of a lake. Then the laser cannons finally retargeted and began blowing up the behemoths, though it took at least 2 shots, one to pop the shield and another to potentially disable, depending on where it hit. The bunkers weren't getting unscratched either. The war droids' firepower began flaying their weapon emplacements, silencing them one after another. Then more silver smoke obscured the enemy, and they became little more than ghost, visible only when they fired. =RK=, bridge, heavy cruiser warrior, high orbit above Ari Adu. We're being surrounded. Enemy ground forces are about to reach 2 of the moon cannons. Tennant succinctly summarized their predicament. 3 of my theater fleets are collapsing. Only my forces are still keeping the center, but that won't last long. Tarkin admitted. The Confederacy lost most of its munificence in the assault, a lot of the recusants too. However, their battleships were practically untouched ever since the final assault began. Actually sacrificing the escorts and light destroyers for a victory might even be a bargain for the bastards. There were a lot of Republic forces trapped in the pocket. The same advantages that made ramming attacks suicidal unless they were a part of a large offensive also meant that none of the Loyalists had a chance to escape in hyperspace. We're hanging a bit better, however my escorts are practically gone along with a third of the battle line. My remaining Venators and heavy cruisers are taking a beating. Tennant continued with the good news. We always knew we won't be able to stop the bastards if they just kept coming and decided to pay the price. Tarkin grudgingly admitted. I honestly didn't expect them to be willing to do so. It's Vale's fault, I guess. He must have pissed off our guests. A ghost of a smile flashed over Tennant's face. Speaking about him, Gideon trailed off. He better arrive soon, or he'll have to deal with all the Separatists by himself. Tennant nodded grimly. The enemy battle line is advancing, an aide announced. So this is it, Tarkin must. It was honor knowing you, Niels. See you on the other side. It was an honor, Brigadier. Cut off engines and intensify forward firepower. Continue targeting those destroyers. Only when they're all gone, concentrate on the battleships. Tennant ordered to someone off-screen before cutting off the connection. We'll advance until we overtake 4th Theater Fleet, Tarkin ordered. Have 3rd pull back and use those shipyards on the flank for cover. I want them to reform their lines as well as they can and hold their ground. Brigadier, the defenses of the hypervelocity gun had been breached. Enemy commandos with death packs are converging on the generators. The liaison with the ground forces reported. One of the secondary approaches to the ion cannon is about to be overran, and the only available reinforcements might buy half an hour at best. It changes nothing. We might not last half hour anyway. Tarkin shrugged. Gideon was out of options. He couldn't run, couldn't survive for long if he stood his ground, and an attempt to attack would meant that his ships would leave the debris fields surrounding them and providing a partial cover which would lead to them dying faster for no much gain. Actually reaching one or two of the battleships and ramming them was a pipe dream at this point. They had sufficient escorts and firepower to avoid such a fate. All that was left was to fight to the bitter end and hope Vale would arrive before the enemy could take Eridau. RK equals Part 10 RK equals CIC Mandalorian Cruiser Remembrance 3 light-years from Ari Adu, interstellar void. The scouts just exited hyperspace. We've got good connections on all data links, Piet reported. Put the sensor data on the main holotank when available. I ordered and returned my attention to the floating images of the 3 admirals under my command. In the end, I managed to convince the nice folks at Garam that it was in their best interests to send Lind to tag along with us, along with half of their intact navy. However, pulling off that stunt cost me making a lot of enemies among the locals. Still, it was worth it. After the shenanigans they pulled off, I couldn't trust them politically, nor their navy. I was pretty sure they would be ever more determined to go after me in the Senate after the coming battles. Lind and company were going to lead the assault upon the Confederate forces at Eridau, escorting the Freedom, which had both the durability and firepower to take them out if they suddenly got any bright ideas about defecting. I had commanded reluctant and sometimes openly hostile allies in the past. I knew how to keep them in line when the only thing I had available was a very big stick with no real carrots to go around. Needless to say, Lind wasn't feeling particularly patriotic about potentially dying for the Republic in the coming battle. The sense I got from him was that while he wasn't pleased by the prospect of being neutral or siding with the Separatists, he preferred such an outcome if the alternative was fighting what he saw as a superior enemy with an arguably good cause. Ironically, if the new CIS leadership played their cards right, they might objectively become the good guys in this sordid affair. For a lot of the worlds in the Outer Rim, they were already a better alternative than what the Republic was willing to offer, which at least partially explained the attitude of Garantham's politicians and military. However, that little truth didn't change the fact that their actions during the battle were borderline treason. Civil wars were criffing messy and seldom black and white, who knew? A major pain in the arse too, no matter the opportunities they presented. Like feeding a bit of disinformation to Lind and company, stating that we would be leaving in no less than 30 hours when I had the fleet moving 20 hours after we secured Garentham. I personally found it mightily suspicious that when we arrived we found the Separatist throwing everything, including multiple kitchen sinks, at Tennant in an obvious attempt to remove him from play before we could arrive. The raw sensor data finally came through. That's a right mess, Vex pointed out. What looked like all the Separatist forces in the system were busy assaulting the Tennant's fleet, along with whatever still survived from the local navy. The Confederacy appeared to be winning too, though all the wrecks surrounding the planet were a testament that our boys and girls had put up a hell of a fight. That simply wouldn't do. I shook my head. Vex, you're taking out that reserve force hanging out 15 light seconds from the moon. I'm leaving all bombers with you. Jump in their faces and blow them away from my battle space. Joanna, you and Lind are hitting the bottom of the enemy formation attacking the moon. I'll be working on them from above. We'll do a modified variant of what we used against the northern force at Garentham. Take out the battleships first. Whatever escorts are left can be handled by Tennant's people. This is going to be painful for our pilots, Vex noted. Using hyper-capable bombers to jump in their faces and shoot first is probably the best way to utilize our small craft until we figure out a better countermeasures for the Guardian. I shrugged. Honestly, I was astounded of how well the criffing thing worked. I expected a moderately effective defense against small craft and instead got a real game-changer. Begin coordinating with your forces. We'll be making a synchronized insertion for a best effect. May the Force serve you well in the battles to come. Once the conference call was over, I began issuing orders to my task force. I actually got 2/3 of the Republic forces to play with the rest going to Vex and Holt, being left with babysitting our new allies. My plan was rough but workable. I was going to use the silencer to breach the shields of a battleships, then finish ASAP by concentrating on it. While the weapon recharged, the whole task force would focus its firepower on another, which would allow us to take care of it in a short order. Before taking some losses, it should be possible to take out a Lucrehulk that way, reasonably fast. By then the silencer would have recharged, and a third battleship would die in a short order. I got the necessary orders out, along with some tweaks on the offensive formation we were going to use just in time, because the calculations were ready. Engage, I ordered, and thus rendered myself a mere spectator until something unexpected happened. =RK equals. Under the ideal conditions and at the maximum speed of military hyperdrives, crossing mere 3 light years could be done very fast. Somewhere between 8 to 9 seconds if we got as fast as the slowest ship in my fleet could travel. The conditions were good, though we went for precision and safety, considering we were going to appear on the edge of 2 gravity wells and aimed to get as close as possible to a bunch of Lucrehulks. So we spent leisurely 2 minutes in hyperspace before arriving at Ari Adu. A few tense seconds followed until our targeting systems and sensors could stabilize and their raw data processed. That gave the enemy just enough time to figure out how criffed they were. Silencer is up, target locked firing, Piet reported. The plot updated. We were in almost perfect position, behind 4 Lucrehulks, which would need to turn if they wanted to aim most of their firepower at us. The closest one flashed, and its red symbol turned amber, signifying moderate damage. Its shields were gone and my fleet unleashed all its fury upon its hull. 30 seconds later it was a mission-killed wreck, and the task force shifted its attention to the next target. While a Lucrehulk could duke it out with up to 8 Venators for extended periods of time and cripple or destroy more than a few before going down, when 7 of the cruisers, 8 acclimators, 1 dreadnought and a bunch of escorts concentrated their firepower on a single battleship, its shields tended to overload in short order. The second Lucrehulk began taking moderate damage before the enemy could put any significant resistance. By the time they turned so the bulk of their firepower could be aimed at us, half of the battleships were out of the game. Silencer is up, acquiring targeting solution, Piet reported. Target locked firing, he exclaimed, and another Lucrehulk turned amber. Whoever was in charge over there figured out that they were criffed. The battleships were too deep in the gravity well to get out before we pounded them to scrap, and they weren't going to be able to take out more than a single Venator before being overwhelmed. Instead, the bastards focused on my escorts. I gave the order for them to hide behind my battle line, however it came too late for 3 of my light cruisers and 5 frigates. I had to helplessly watch them be methodically dismantled by the battle wagons before only one of the behemoths was left. By the time it shifted its fire on my leading Venator, the outcome was predetermined. Even the Lucrehulk's significant firepower was unable to overload the cruiser's shields before its own defenses collapsed, and it was bathed in turbo laser fire. Full ahead, take us over the upper edge of the battle. The targeting priority remains unchanged. All units are free to independently maneuver within the formation. I ordered, then called up a smaller tactical display to look at the rest of the battle. Joanna had used her ship to a devastating effect. She had practically ran over a group of 5 battleships, complete with escorts without slowing down, and left only a field of cooling debris in her wake. The Freedom was already engaging the enemy forces, fighting Tenant. Next was Vex. He was ducking it with an almost equal Separatist force, and was apparently willing. However, from what the sensors were telling me, the bomber force was gutted even if it apparently did its job. Comms, can you raise either Admiral Tennant or whoever is in charge of the local navy? I asked. No can do, sir. There's too much interference, came the prompt reply. Hopefully they were still alive. The enemy is attempting to break off, the sensor operator exclaimed. The Criff. I didn't have any forces in position to pursue. At least most of them were within the gravity wells and coming into range fast. A light destroyer division accelerated towards us at ramming vectors and flank speed backed up by 5 battleships that broke off their attack on Tenant and headed our way. However, most of the enemy was scrambling to get away, not to fight. Use the silencer on the destroyers. Reverse thrust. I want to hold off contact with the Lucrehulks. For 2 minutes, I ordered. Just in time for the silencer to reload. Targets locked it and firing, Pied announced 10 seconds later. The battleships paused. With all the chaos, ECM, and general jamming, they probably weren't aware how exactly we took out the first Lucrahulk group. That hesitation was going to prove fatal. The silencer was going to be ready for sure before the first Lucrahulk entered effective range. We were going to win unless something got criffed up in a major way. Catching the enemy out of position and engaging their naval forces in manageable chunks, along with the Freedom and my superweapon, made that a foregone conclusion. Unfortunately, the bastard refused to just die. That was one of the reasons why I call them the enemy after all. Even as the first Lucrahulk was crippled by the silencer and then pounded to scrap, one of my Venators, which was doing its best to shield my own ship, was singled out and taken apart by concentrated fire. We managed to go take another battleship out before the silencer recharged. However, we traded another cruiser, 2 assault ships, and 2/3 of my remaining escorts for that privilege. The silence spoke again, and a third Lucrahulk became vulnerable. It died too. Keep covering the Remembrance, physical intercept if you have to, I ordered. My remaining ships no longer had the firepower to take out a battleship's shields without ducking it out for a prolonged period of time. However, as long as the silencer was operational, we could sidestep that issue. 2 more capital ships were damaged to some extent, including my own, before the enemy could be taken out. Jamming is clearing up. We still don't have contact with Admiral Tennant or the locals' commander, a Brigadier Tarkin, the comm lieutenant reported. Carry on and keep trying. I looked at the tactical plot and zoomed out. Joanna was already pulling up, and she continued to wreck anything that came in her range. On an even brighter note, half of Lynn's forces were already gone. Hopefully he was going to get himself killed sooner rather than later and save me a few headaches. Vex was still busy. He was maneuvering wildly around an enemy which was doing its best to flee too, considering they had lost up to half their original numbers. In contrast, the Admiral had lost mere 4 ships, a single Venator on Acclimator with heavy damage, and his escorts were reduced to a quarter of their original numbers. The less said for the bombers, the better. I want a report form both the planetary and moon surface when available. If necessary, prepare our ground troops for deployment. I hoped it wasn't to be necessary. Doing so would mean leaving a lot of them on Ari Adu when I leave for Camino. The remaining enemy forces finally broke. They either scattered or went for ramming attacks, something that hit Tennant's people and Lynn's friends quite hard. At least my own task force was still far enough so we could shoot up with impunity any suicidal moron who headed our way. Finally, it was all over but the screaming. 147, Chapter 36, Parts 1 and 2. Disclaimer: I do not own Gundam Seed or Star Wars. They belong to their respective copyright owners. This story is not created with commercial aim. I make no money from it. Phase 36, Operation Southern Star, equals RK equals. Part 1, 2nd Platoon, Black Company, 41st Battalion, the Grim Reapers. Criffing die already, Hound roared at a commando droid that attempted to gut him with a vibroblade. It managed to criff up the sergeant's rifle, forcing the NCO to bash its head with the stock. He threw the useless weapon away and drew his sidearm. ASB appeared at the torn-apart door, leaving out of the bunker, and Hound put 3 quick shots between its eyes. The machine spluttered and died, blocking the exit and buying the clone a brief reprieve. Dex, without reinforcements, we're all dead and the cannon is lost. Hound growled, I would like to avoid that. Everything's committed, sir. We're actually here. A deep voice sounded from the exit. The destroyed droids flew away from the door, and a tall man wearing an armor identical to Hound's came in, followed by a much shorter girl. Jedi Knight Garrett, at your service, Sergeant. Come on, we have some clankers to kick out of here. The Jedi exclaimed and vanished through the door. The kid gave them a shy wave and followed the man. Competent ones? Dex asked. They better be, or we're all dead. Hound grumbled. He looked around and grabbed the gun of a fallen local, then followed the Jedi outside. It's a good day to die, Dex muttered. Criff it, I don't want to die. He shook his head and followed the sergeant. It was pure hell outside. The enemy was swarming over the bunkers, which had their built-in weapons disabled. The only reason why the place hadn't been overran was a GAR company charging the clankers. Dex ducked under a swing and jumped away from the commando droid that nearly gutted him. He promptly shot the clanker, then dived for cover when one of the new big droids came behind the corner. The Jedi ran towards it, using their lightsabers to parry blaster bolts coming from weapons built into its side. They were almost upon it when both jumped back to avoid a shield snapping around the machine. It slammed its legs into the ground for better stability, and its shoulder-mounted cannons tracked the tall Jedi. The man wasted no time and made an impossibly long jump to clear the firing arc. He even managed to parry some shots that came his way while he was in the air. The Jedi landed lightly on his feet, then paused and raised a hand towards the big droid. Dex never knew what the officer planned to do. The Jedi suddenly exploded in action and dived away. Garam wasn't fast enough. 2 white lances shot from a droid no one saw coming and hit less than a meter from the Jedi. He was picked up by the resulting explosion and thrown away like a twig. Dex winced when the man hit the ground. There was no way anyone, even a Jedi, could walk from something like that. The girl screamed in surprise, then sprinted towards her master. The sergeant shouted a warning, but she either didn't hear it or didn't care. "Draw its attention," Hound ordered and opened fire on the closest war droid, and Dex followed suit. The blaster bolts splashed over its shields, and the criffing thing paid them no attention. Instead, it leveled its guns at the 2 Jedi. "So much for making it through this," Dex groaned. The world flashed in blue, and he screamed as what felt like electricity washed over him. The last thing Dex recalled was seeing naked lighting dancing all over that criffing war droid. Then the pain became too much, and he knew no more. RK equals. Bridge, Corellian Cruiser Freedom. High orbit above Ari Adu. Going by appearance alone, Gideon Tarkin wasn't an impressive man. He was thin, almost sickly-looking, with receding brown hair. His injuries didn't help matters. The Brigadier's right hand was shattered when his flagship ran afoul of 2 Lucrehulks, which were too deep in the gravity well to run. At least he was alive and would recover in time. The same couldn't be said for Tennant. His Venator was rammed by a light destroyer at the end of the battle. The cruiser was a wreck, still combed by SR teams who were making their way to the CIC as fast as they could. However, there simply wasn't a clear route to that compartment. The rear admiral could be dead or dying for all we knew, and there wasn't anything more that could be done. Tarkin sat in the seat waiting for him and groaned quietly. "Brigadier, it's good to finally meet you in person. I've heard good things about you and your brother. There were enough wrecked Separatist ships here when we arrived to prove those rumors true, I see." I smiled. "The same goes for you, General. Your reputation precedes you." Tarkin nodded. "I'm glad you arrived in time. The situation was getting unpleasant," Gideon added dryly. I chuckled. The man was a master of understatement, it seemed. "We got here as fast as we could, and we'll be leaving soon," I said. "Back to the core or Camino?" Tarkin asked. "The latter. Unless I take every relatively intact ship in the system, I won't be able to fight my way to friendly territory in the core without losing everything but the freedom. Besides, they probably could use any help they could get," I explained. "Yes, they will be facing another powerful force." Gideon nodded. "I take it this isn't a social call, General. Number with Tennant's situation unknown. I'll be placing all Republic forces that I'm leaving here under your command, Brigadier." "I appreciate the trust. How many ships will you take?" Tarkin asked. "Every relatively intact Republic cruiser and assault ship. We'll be leaving as soon as some basic repairs and resupply are complete," I added. "That will leave the whole quadrant significantly weakened," Tarkin pointed out. "I'm aware." I turned around and went to the window. The space outside was cluttered with dead and damaged ship. Moths of light flew all around them, SAR units doing their best to cut out wounded crew members before it was too late. Too many weren't going to make it anyway. In the last week, the Separatists lost the bulk of a whole sector fleet and 2 standard ones in this quadrant alone. While the theater fleets you assembled, a good idea by the way, were gutted, the enemy lacks the assets to threaten this system. You should be able to repair a lot of the ships I'm leaving behind, as well as recover some of the wrecks littering the system. I'll be doing my best to ensure that no matter what happens at Camino, the Separatist would find it hard to come your way with overwhelming force. At worst, I'll lead them on a chase towards the core." I turned my back to the carnage outside and smiled at Gideon. After Geonosis and the last 2 battles I commanded, I'm sure that our Confederate friends will do their best to remove me as a threat. If things got criffed up at Camino, you might not have the numbers to get away, General. Even if you take every ship that's not too badly damaged with you, that won't be a big fleet, Tarkin said. I know. I'll simply have to play the hand I've been dealt. Presuming that we don't get killed in the next few months, I have some thoughts on how best to utilize Ari Adu. I would like to run a few ideas past you, Brigadier. RK equals Flag Bridge, Corellian Cruiser Freedom, high orbit above Ari Adu. Firmus Piet felt a lot of apprehension. This was the second time this week he had to deliver a report about the devastating losses the fleet suffered. The fact that the enemy was mauled even worse was small comfort for all people who died here and at Garantham. Piet gathered his courage, took a deep calming breath and walked in. His expression briefly faltered when he saw that not only the general but the two admirals, Holt and Vex, were waiting for him. The lieutenant went to the table where they sat talking and saluted. Firmus, good. You have the reports? Vale returned the salute and asked, Right here, sir. Piet offered one of the data pads he was carrying. He still found it eerie how the general thought nothing of using his abilities for little things, like picking the device with his mind and making it float into a waiting hand. The Jedi seldom did such stuff, though Firmus wasn't really sure why. I knew it was bad, but this, Criffit, we got mauled, Vale grumbled. Give us the sordid details, Lieutenant. I promise I won't shoot the messenger, nor space him. Vale joked grimly. I'm glad to hear that, sir. I'll begin with what we'll have available in 2 days, if that's all right with you, General. Piet smiled nervously. It is. Calm down, man. I don't bite unless you're my wife and ask nicely. That was too much criffing information. We'll have 5 Venators and 6 Acclimators ready for extended travel and heavy combat, as well as a single dreadnought heavy cruiser. The situation with the escorts isn't much better, just a single light cruiser and 15, perhaps 16 frigates. Admiral Vex began cursing in an unknown language. The general answered in the same. The clone shook his head and slammed a fist in the table. Carry on, Lieutenant. How much of the fleet we actually lost, and how much is fit for dockyard time? Vex growled. It gets worse, I recon. The general muttered and waved him to continue. You're regrettably correct, sir. Acclimators, 36 destroyed and 19 damaged. At least the crew losses are significantly lighter, 31%. No doubt thanks to the heavier defenses on those ships. Gentlemen, we got criffed up, Holt declared quietly. We've got a single operational heavy cruiser, 12 lost, and 5 more needing extensive repairs. Their crews fared best, only 20% casualties across the board. That's something, Vex muttered. Do I dare ask about the escorts? Holt asked. The situation there is bad. We lost 47 light cruisers, 20 are fit for either scrap or extensive time in the dock, and 3 are MIA. The overall casualty rate is 59%. Firmus winced. Needless to say, the frigates suffered even worse. 36 consular frigates and 88 CR Nintis are confirmed as destroyed. Almost 40 are with significant damage and 4 are missing. Casualties among their crews are the worst, about 72%. It makes sense. When a capital ship hits one of the bugs, usually everyone dies. Holt sighed. What about our esteemed allies? Vale asked. Brigadier Tarkin's theatre fleets suffered heavy casualties. We don't have final numbers, however the current estimate is for 42 cruisers lost, over 90 destroyers and over 110 frigates among the 4 fleets defending Ari Adu. That number includes the 10 cruisers and 23 escorts Admiral Lind lost. That's... Admiral Holt trailed off. It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Vale asked. I honestly never thought I'll witness, much less fight in a battle bigger than Geonosis. The last few days. Holt shook her head. I hope we accounted ourselves well enough, Vale asked hopefully. That's the only good news I can think about right now, sir. We've got only estimates. Proper numbers would need to wait until all sensor logs are checked over and enemy wrecks are accounted for. Piet said. He glanced at the datapad he held. We gutted them all right. 400-plus munificents, over 200 recusant light destroyers, between 35 and 40 battleships. That's a lot of scrap. The clone admiral whistled. A pleased smile slowly appeared on his face. How long could they sustain such losses? At least as long as us. The general wasn't too pleased at those numbers. To put things in perspective, if our friends in intelligence know what they're talking about, we've destroyed somewhere between 2 to 3% of the total enemy navy from before the offensive began. If we keep achieving such victories, both sides would have lost their navies before anyone could achieve a victory. It's not that bad. With all those battleships gone, we're overall ahead in the firepower department, though the raw number of lost ships isn't exactly favoring us. Holt said, then paused. I think that all of us could actually use some shut-eye before thinking about the price of this victory. A drink, too, when I think about it. Some good Mandalorian spirits, perchance. Vex perked up. I might have a bottle or two for special occasions. Surviving the last 2 battles counts, I recon. The general looked at Piet. Firmus, care to join us? You look a bit pale. I dot. Ah, why not? Declining the invitation didn't strike him as the best possible idea. I'll like to, sir, if it isn't too much trouble. The general waved a hand, and a bottle appeared from under the table, followed by 4 glasses. Piet shook his head and went to join the flag officers. =RK=. Part 2. Bridge, Droid Command Ship, Magnificent Annihilation. Duro. Couple of minutes after the bulk of his fleet exited hyperspace, Admiral Tonith was speaking with Trench. You're just in time. The arachnid-like alien made a grimace that might have been a smile, before half his face had been replaced by cybernetics anyway. We're on the clock after all. I couldn't afford to be late, for all our sakes. Tonith answered. I'm sending you the updated course now. When your ships are ready, we're all leaving, Trench said. Naturally, as far as my people could figure out, we've been able to fool the enemy. I've sent the decoy fleet towards Belassa and then Kuat to aid in Ningo's distraction, Tonith reported. Even if they sent their reserves at Corellia, I have a few ideas on how to handle them. Even Trench's few remaining natural eyes gleamed at that announcement. With a bit of luck, our raiding fleets might slip in unnoticed too. Either way, we've got enough ships and firepower to succeed. That we do. Tonith smiled. It took them weeks to clean up the surrounding space from enemy scouts, not to mention the ships expended in taking out listening posts and jamming the holonet in the nearby systems. However, they were finally ready. And the 4th and last sector fleet meant to hit the Corellia had arrived at. Duro an hour or so before Tonith's own forces. I want you and your senior commanders on board my ship for the transit. We'll use the time for some additional training and further refining out plans. You'll get back for the last leg of the journey. Trench continued. This is going to be the biggest battle the galaxy has seen in more than 1,000 years. The alien fixed Tonith with all his eyes. The stuff of legends, history books, and more importantly, the one that decides if we lose the war in a few short years or actually earn a chance to win it. I'm well aware of what's at stake, Tonith shot back. I know, it bears repeating. Get your people moving. I'll meet you in the hangar. Trench out. =RK=. Confederacy Council Chamber, Raxus Prime. It was rare to see the whole council gathered in the same room, Vombra thought. However, it was understandable. The offensive was entering its most critical stage, and they all wanted a briefing on how it was going, which unfortunately was a mixed bag lately. Naturally, the damned Sith were to blame. Suimane, Ilroth, and Hill finally took their seats, joining him, Argente and Nudo, at the table. Cleo went over the motions of the inefficient pleasantries everyone exchanged and felt relief when they finally got to the point. We've got both good and bad news from the front. Hill, who was chosen as a chairman for today, began. Most of the secondary objectives of the offensive are complete. Only Mon Cala still holds in the far eastern reaches of the galaxy. Our various territories are connected by direct hyperlanes, and we're fortifying the key systems on those routes. It's good to get an official confirmation about that, Chairman. Mai smiled. Unfortunately, our efforts in securing the whole Western Galactic Quadrant met unfortunate end. Hill continued. Explain. I've heard rumors of heavy fighting, but that's all. Passel snapped and began rubbing one of his horns. Vale, We still lack a complete picture. However, it appears that about 8 days ago, he reached Bespin with his containment fleet. There, he linked up with the bulk of the Republic naval forces in the region before moving on Garantham. There, he engaged roughly 2/3 of the sector fleet sent to clean up the sector and won. Another crushing defeat at his hands. Ilroth groaned, "I hate the Sith." "I don't like where this is going," Nudo hissed. "You won't," Hill continued. Vale arrived while our forces in the systems were busy reducing the enemy naval forces. He caught them out of position and managed to defeat them in detail. Only a small part of our fleets there managed to get away. However, we've got confirmation from both agents on Ari Adu, sensor probes, and a few scouts left behind that our forces slated to subdue the Western Quadrant and the GAR naval presence there practically managed a mutual kill. If it wasn't for that Corellian cruiser or the Sith new weapon, there's at least one with Vale, we would have won. That actually not so bad. Ilroth perked up. Our analysts believe that once he's resupplied and conducted some repairs, Vale will attempt to reinforce either Camino or Naboo. The former is more likely. Vombra announced, "What forces can he bring?" "That Corellian pain in the arse, 10 or so cruisers and assault ships with a few escorts," Vombra answered. "That ship can take on a fleet by itself," Mai pointed out. "Yes, the Corellian cruiser is the primary threat. We're considering letting them reach Camino, then concentrate all the forces we can support in that area and crush them," Vombra said. "I concur," Hill agreed. "There's an interesting piece of information that finally made it back from our agents at Coruscant. It appears that the Republic intelligence services had underestimated our total naval strength." San smiled. "How so?" Mai asked. "They got the total number of our sector fleets mostly right and estimate them to be 100 plus. Hill's smile grew wider. However, for some unknown reason, they appear to believe that each fleet is made of 200 to 4,000 ships at the high end. Vombra let out an electronic chuckle. "Are you telling us that they underestimated our numbers by an order of magnitude at least?" the cyborg asked. "Yes. My guess is that they saw what we've been building up for the offensive and made their conclusions based on those numbers." Hill shrugged. "It's too bad that due to logistics, we're unable to leverage our full strength against the core. We'll need a lot of those ships to counter the enemy retaliation in a few months anyway, and a lot of the older ships are being upgraded as we speak, and thus not available," Vombra added. "That news is heartening," Mai said. "The situation in the core?" "So far, it's going mostly according to plan. There were just 2 setbacks. Trench lost more forces securing Duro than anticipated, though we could afford them as long as the primary objective is complete. The other problem was how long it took Ningo to capture Antar. The Republic made a stand there behind formidable fortifications. While we're controlling the system and fortifying it in turn, the planet itself is still under siege. There are 2 army groups down there, and they're all dug in around the shield generators. Unpleasant, though not unexpected. Corellia and Kuat, that's what's important," Argent interjected. "It remains to be seen. Ningo has been reinforced and should reach Neimodia tonight. Once he gets more up-to-date intelligence, he'll go after Balmora and from there Kuat. One of our fleets is capturing Balassa as we speak and go for Kuat too afterward." "That makes what? A heavy reinforced sector fleet going there?" Nudo asked. "Oh, that's going to be ugly." Ilroth winced. "Corellia?" Argente asked. "Admiral Tonith reached Duro yesterday, and he should be moving towards Corellia as we speak. His sector fleet was brought back to full strength with the arrival of his 2nd and 3rd task forces. In addition, 3rd Fondor sector fleet was dispatched to join the assault." Vombra explained. "That's a lot of ships, no matter how you put it." Nudo nodded. "Will they be enough?" "I trust Admiral Trench. He's the best we have. However, it's an unfortunate truth that a victory can't be guaranteed. Unless we got lucky and the enemy reserves are dispatched towards Kuat, Trench will be facing 2 full Republic sector fleets, Corellia's navy, including 5 of their big cruisers, and the system's defenses." "That's heh." Nudo chuckled nervously. "When was the last time such a battle happened?" "I think there were 1 or 2 similar engagements during the new Sith Wars. The last one that's properly documented, are from the Great War between the Old Republic and the Sith Empire. We'll have to trust Trench to win, won't we? Mai asked. He'll do it. I'm confident in his abilities, Ilroth said. What's the status of the rest of the galaxy? In the east, only Mandalore holds. However, our advance in Republic space in the expansion region is slowing down due to stiffening enemy resistance. We're still not 100% sure where the Republic is going to draw the line and attempt to actually stop us. So far, they've fortified only the important industrial worlds in our path and falling back unless they can rely on decent system defense to back them up, Hill answered. My guess is the Inner Rim, depending on how cold-blooded and pragmatic their Senate could be persuaded to be. My guess is that we'll hit heavy resistance once we reach the eastern fringes of the Inner Rim. We've got reports of a sector fleet being assembled there, with another being spread out and harassing our advance all over that quadrant. 148th, Chapter 36, Parts 3 and 4. Phase 36, Operation Southern Star. RK equals. Part 3. Flag Bridge, Republic Cruiser, Light Solace, Camino. General Rancisis, the enemy is entering the system in strength. Our remaining fleets in the sector are making their best speed here, a clone reported. He was Cal, the admiral who used to be in charge of the defense in space before the Jedi Master arrived. Any trace of Vale's fleet? We can use any help we can get, Rancisis asked. His tail coiled around his custom seat and gripped it indignation at what he was forced to do for the good of the galaxy. No, General. As far as we know, he should be somewhere in the western quadrant. Cal answered. Rancisis simply nodded, lost in thoughts. While the Jedi Master agreed that the Sith needed to be removed from power, all these lies, deceptions, they weren't the Jedi way. What he found most disturbing was how easy lying turned out to be. It was too easy. It didn't feel like pushing him towards the dark side, and that more than anything scared Rancisis. Because in the end, even if everything went as planned, or even better, the Sith might have won. Not because they would succeed into eradicating the Jedi, but because they made them to destroy themselves from within, to fall without noticing it. Rancisis frowned. That wasn't a new thought. He had those doubts for months now, however he simply couldn't see a better alternative. What should he do? Betray everything he believed in so he could run and save his own skin while abandoning the galaxy to the Sith? Doing so was simply unacceptable. Another person might have considered running away without doing their best to halt the Sith. That was simply unthinkable for the Jedi, which left them with less than ideal options. Launch fighters and keep them under Guardian coverage at all times. I want all ships constantly executing random evasive maneuvers to minimize the chance of ramming attacks, the Jedi Master ordered. A single command zoomed out the image in the holotank in the center of the tactical table around which Rancisis and his staff were sitting. The hundreds of Republic ships and thousands of fighters became green symbols as the scale increased. Finally, the enemy leading elements became visible. They were coming in cautiously. The closest munificent divisions were entering real space 4 light hours from Camino. First were scouts, which immediately launched vultures to extend their effective sensor coverage. Soon the Separatist numbers began increasing exponentially until Camino was surrounded by a red tide. It wasn't long before jamming and General ECM made scanning the enemy unreliable. General, I'm glad you got here when you did, Cal said. The enemy numbers are about 60% higher than Oni's estimates. Rancisis hissed in annoyance. Was this a mistake, a deliberate deception, or simply the enemy being the enemy? In conjunction with the system defenses, we should be able to hold, the Jedi Master said with confidence he really didn't feel. They probably can call more reinforcements. We aren't so lucky, Cal pointed out. Then we'll have to fight harder. Rancisis shrugged. It was true what he said. It was another deception too. One of the last communiques from Coruscant contained a coded message for his eyes, only using a one-time ancient Jedi cipher. Practically unbreakable if you didn't know the key, which he was given before leaving the temple. The message was short and to the point. The Council had proof that the clone army was a Sith invention and would in all likelihood back up the Sith when this whole charade was over. There were no instructions sent, just that bit of information. Rancisis closed his eyes. What was he supposed to do? Wasn't it enough that he had to lie to and deceive everyone under his command? Ramesses hissed quietly. Camino was the primary source of the clones. There were a few new, smaller facilities, though in the great scheme of things, they were of no consequences. Besides, all of them were cut off behind enemy lines anyway. If Camino fell, the Sith would lose one of their greatest weapons. Without a source to replenish their numbers, by the end of the war, the clone army would be a shadow of its former self at best. The only question was, could Ramesses do it? Could he betray all the men under his command in such a way? Could he dare not do it? Could he risk leaving an intact clone army in the hands of the Sith if the Jedi at Coruscant failed? The Force was quiet. The light side didn't guide him. The dark side didn't attempt to sway him. Ramesses found himself alone with his thoughts, and for the first time since he could remember, the Jedi Master found himself despising the Force. What was one more deception, one more betrayal, when it was to protect the whole galaxy? "We're going with Blue One," Ramesses finally ordered. "May the Force be with us all." The Separatists swarmed forward, and the battle was finally joined. =RK equals Bridge, Droid Command Ship, Death at Dawn, Camino. Ever since he got his updates, TK-51 had experienced many new emotions. The sheer frustration he was feeling after a week of slamming into the Republic forces defending Camino and bouncing back was a new and most certainly not welcomed emotion. Losses on both sides had been steadily mounting. Camino had acquired 2 brand new orbital rings made exclusively by destroyed ships and shattered battle stations. While the enemy was slowly, surely losing, the price was proving almost too heavy. While the Confederacy could afford to spend incredible amounts of resources in order to neutralize this planet once and for all, TK-51 couldn't help it but notice that only droids were thrown in the first 4 assault waves. They did their jobs, shattered the enemy's outer defensive rings, and all but a lucky few were destroyed in the process. For the first time since being built, he found that fact worthy of resentment. TK-51 paused at that revelation and activated his self-diagnostic subroutines before concentrating on the task at hand. He was part of the 6th assault wave, and this one was going to break through to the planet. In fact, TK-51's role was a vital one. All the ships he had captured in previous engagements were repaired and chock-full with advanced droids and the Confederacy's new allies. He was to simulate a running engagement while those ships attempted to seek safety with their friends protecting Camino. Once in positions, they were going to disgorge all the ground forces they had and ram the closest juicy target. That little deception was going to happen while the 5th assault wave was busy throwing itself against the last defense line and all remaining enemy ships, which were still too many for comfort. It was a good plan. A few Republic battle groups evading CIS forces in the sector were able to reach Camino in the last few days. 2 actually fought their way to the planet, losing most of their numbers in the process. One such incursion was the primary reason why the 4th assault wave got gutted instead of achieving its mission with acceptable losses. There was just a single problem. TK-51 had qualms about the Confederacy's new allies, Jedi of all things. That they were supposedly from the old Republic, well, that bit of data didn't make him feel any better. Still, TK-51 was a Confederate tactical droid with a mission, and he was going to do it to the best of his abilities. An alarm sounded. The plot updates showing 10 Republic cruisers exiting hyperspace in a zone reasonably far away from CIS forces. TK-51 began issuing orders, including a calculation of hyperspace insertion coordinates in front of the new enemy. Letting them plausibly get away was going to be tricky. =RK equals Part 4 =RK equals CIC Republic Cruiser Daring, high orbit over Camino. Wilhuff Tarkin was a man running out of what little patience he had left. His homeworld had been under siege for weeks now, with no word of what was happening there. His brother was there holding the line, and he had no idea if Gideon was still alive, if the rest of his family was safe. If that wasn't enough, someone in Republic intelligence had criffed up by the numbers. There was supposed to be a single reinforced Separatist fleet assaulting Camino. They could have stopped such a force. Instead, they came knocking with thrice the expected numbers. That was bad. However, the combined Republic fleet and fortifications should have been enough to hold off the enemy for a long time. A month, perhaps more, unless they got heavy reinforcements and could afford to waste ships, or the Jedi in charge went with an overly passive plan that saw both sides trading ships at a rate the Republic couldn't sustain. General Rancisis, if we continue trading ships with the enemy at this rate, we're going to lose the system. Tarkin growled at the Jedi. Why did High Command put that madman in charge anyway? Wilhuff had been pondering that question ever since Rancisis arrived. Why couldn't they send PL? The man might have been annoying as hell, however Tarkin couldn't deny his competence. Give the order, and I'll lead a counterattack against their next assault. If we bloody them bad enough, we'll buy ourselves more time. Letting the enemy have the initiative and dictate the tempo of the engagement is suicide, Tarkin snapped. Thank you, Admiral. He nodded in gratitude. The Separatist can't keep these assaults for much longer. Rancisis dismissed the suggestion. We still have fleets pulling back to reinforce us. Fleets that are being chased by enemy forces that would at best make sure the overall situation doesn't change, Tarkin shot back. I will not send our men to die pointlessly, Rancisis hissed. We've got another convoy coming back. I suggest we continue this discussion later. Cal stated after an aide got his attention. Zoom out, we've got more strays coming home. I want to know how many and where they are, Wilhuff ordered. Aye, sir. The image changed. 10 cruisers apparently got lucky. While they were obviously damaged, they arrived away from any nearby enemy forces that could immediately threaten them. If they were fast and lucky enough, they might even make it without being engaged. Which task force? Tarkin asked. Thanks to ECM from enemy units between his ship and the newcomers, the IFF couldn't be read. We're analyzing now, sir. The officer in charge of the sensors reported. Wilhuff frowned. They were out of position. It would take him longer to reach them than the newcomers would need to make another jump to the edge of the gravity well. A minute passed while the convoy headed towards Camino at maximum acceleration. Separatist units were moving to intercept them, but unless they could plot a hyperspace insertion coordinates in time, the survivors would make it. Another minute was almost up, and the hyperdrives should be ready soon. Sir, we've got preliminary analysis. We've got ships from multiple task forces. The officer paused. That can't be right. What is it, Commander? Tarkin asked. At least one of those ships is reported lost. 2 more are from a battle group we lost contact with more than 2 weeks ago. Wilhuff's blood froze. Those weren't Republic ships. They were Separatist now. Give me a line to Cal and Rancisis now, Tarkin snapped. Long seconds passed. The ships came closer and closer. Then a Separatist force jumped almost in their path, but not quite. The newcomers altered their vectors a bit to avoid collision, and fire was exchanged. For a moment, Tarkin thought he was mistaken, then shook his head. This was a masterful deception, nothing more. What is it? We're busy, Commodore, Rancisis hissed angrily. It's a trap. Those ships are under enemy control, Tarkin explained. That's why the enemy is engaging them? The Jedi sneered. Stop wasting my time, Commodore. Tarkin grit his teeth when Rancisis cut off the channel. He looked at the holotank just in time to see the convoy vanishing. Captain, I want the task force advancing towards the flagship. We're being had, Wilhuff ordered. Before he was finished, the cruisers appeared on the edge of the gravity well. They didn't alter their course, but instead continued to accelerate. Separatist ships attempting such a stunt would have been blown to pieces. However, no one opened fire on those units. Then the enemy jumped the gun and sent the next assault wave. Well done. Tarkin nodded in grudging respect. He doubted that those cruisers would be stopped now, not when a couple of 100 enemy ships threw themselves against the defenders as a distraction. Engage the enemy. Continue moving towards the flagship. Have the local reserve take our place, Tarkin ordered. A few seconds later, he called sensor image of those cruisers. No one was shooting at them yet. Damned fools, Wilhuff grumbled. Finally, someone over there figured that something was wrong. 2 Venators began maneuvering to avoid being hit. The pair of Golan platforms that were targeted too had nowhere to go and weren't shooting yet, damn it. 8 of the captured cruisers opened their hangars and began launching assault transports and vultures to screen them. They also opened fire, and only now Rancisis and company deemed fit to return the favor. It was too little too late. The defending fleet couldn't leverage enough firepower at those cruisers to take them out in time. One slammed into Cal's flagship, and soon both of them were expanding clouds of debris. Another clipped Ramses's ship, yet didn't manage a mutual kill. Why the hell the decent man had to die while Ramses's likely survived? Tarkin wanted to scream in frustration. Then, to his utter lack of surprise, things got worse. The two Golan stations were hit by 3 Venators each, and that was more than they could handle. Final defensive fire from nearby ships shot down some droid fighters and transports, though most of them passed through the shield and too damn many continued towards the surface under their own power. The remaining rogue cruisers breached the atmosphere and began barely controlled glide towards the oceans below after being mostly disabled by the shield. Unfortunately, they opened their hangars before that, and more transports that were shielded by their motherships launched and began their descent. As if all that wasn't a big enough disaster, the enemy sent 3 whole battleship divisions at the gap in the orbital defenses above Tipoca City. "Is Ramesses reachable?" Tarkin asked. "We can't raise the flag," the comm officer answered after a few tries. "At least something good came out of this. Give me a fleet-wide channel," Tarkin ordered. He took a deep breath and put his thoughts in order. "This is Commodore Wilhuff Tarkin. Admiral Cal's ships was just destroyed, and General Ramses's flag took crippling damage. The Jedi Master is currently out of contact. I'm assuming command of the fleet. Contingency Arubesh 3 is now in effect. All forces are to counterattack if practical. 1st to 3rd Reserve Squadrons move in to plug the gap. I'm moving my battle group to assist." Wilhuff made a motion to cut the channel. Tarkin sighed in relief. Now all he had to do was to deal with the enemy and ensure that Ramesses wouldn't be retaking command of the Navy. "Call Master Shark T. I need to talk with her." If Ramesses was still alive, which was a given considering Tarkin's luck lately, he was going to ensure that the overgrown snake would be somewhere he could be actually useful, like down at the capital, keeping at bay the enemy troops he allowed to land. =RK equals Assault Transport Omega-3, Camino. Captain Romilda Vance sat strapped in her seat and wondered how the criff she ended up in this criffing mess. The war was supposed to be over, lost. Every fight, every sacrifice made irrelevant when the Navy collapsed after a week of heavy fighting all across the galaxy, leaving the Sith Empire victorious. As if that wasn't enough, the small fleet bringing Havoc Squad home, possibly one of the last battle groups that the Republic still had, suffered a hyperspace accident that somehow stranded them in a strange and terrible future. Romilda grimaced. The news that everything they knew had been gone for thousands of years was too much after the defeat. It broke too many of the people who had survived everything the Sith could throw at them. Only figuring out that the Republic had preserved and controlled the galaxy stopped the wave of suicides and people who had simply given up and refused to live. For a few days, that news had injected life into the remnant as they began to call themselves. That lasted just as long as it took to figure out that this so-called Republic wasn't anything like they expected. Rampant corruption, inefficient Senate that was practically useless. The command staff had gathered to decide what to do. There were a lot of angry people at that meeting. The remnant needed a cause, a reason to keep going, and Master Perion gave them precisely that. A goal, a cause to fight for. Even now, a few years later, Romilda had no idea how the discussion had turned from talks of reforming the new Republic into finding a way to tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. It wasn't something that happened suddenly. As the remnant learned more about the Republic and talked with people on a dozen of worlds in the Outer Rim, they began seeing some uncomfortable things. Then they heard about Count Dooku, a former Jedi leading a secessionist movement after being disgusted with the Republic. Feelers were sent, agents met him to hear his side. The tiding they brought was the final coffin. The Republic had been under the control of the Sith for years now. Dooku even presented some kind of proof, though Vance didn't see it herself. Once that became known across the remnant, all of them were outraged. Felt the betrayal, after all they had suffered through, after all they had sacrificed and lost. Finding a Republic controlled by the Sith was too much. The remnant had their cause. They had an enemy. It was that simple. The only snag was when Master Perion found out that Dooku himself was a Sith too. That's when the remnant almost broke beyond repairing. It was only the Jedi Master's charisma that got them through the last shattering blow. Romilda smiled at the thought. If it wasn't for Perian being able to pull them through and give them a reason to go on, Vance was sure that even she would have bitten the blaster sooner than later. When the Jedi Master spoke, everyone could hear the conviction in his voice. Everyone could see his point. The New Republic was a corrupt mess that needed to be torn down. The CIS wasn't much better with a Sith in charge. Things became clear. They weren't sent into the future as a joke by a merciless universe. They were here to save the galaxy from the Sith and the corrupted monster that usurped their republic. It all made sense. They got a noble reason to go on, to fight, to live. Perian was right too. The remnant actions caused the Confederacy to overthrow the Sith leading them, making an alliance to save the Republic citizens from Dooku's master and that monster Viel possible. That's why Romilda was here, in the back of an assault transport leading a company of remnant special forces and a pair of Jedi attached to her command. They were going to cripple the New Republic's clone production and retrieve the GAR's gene templates. A victory on Camino would be the first step in the open towards restoring the real Republic. Romilda smiled and her eyes shone with a purpose. It was high time to show those cloned fakes what proper Republic soldiers were like. 149th, Chapter 36, Parts 5 and 6. Phase 36, Operation Southern Star. RK equals. Part 5, GAR Command Center, Tipoca City, Camino. Shakti rubbed her forehead and groaned. She wondered what the Council thought when they arranged Rancisis to be put in charge of the naval units in the system, if they thought anything at all. Commodore Tarkin, your request is approved. You have command of the fleet. When Master Rancisis is recovered, please send him down here. We need to have a chat, the younger Jedi Master said. Thank you, ma'am. Tai could feel Tarkin's relief. Can you spare some fighters? Too many of the enemy transports are going to reach Tipoca. We lack enough air assets and AA to stop the bulk of their forces before landing, the Jedi Master asked. I'll see what I can do, General. Our torrent wings took a serious beating. Tarkin looked away. Send in the rest of the reserve now. Concentrate on the leading battleships, the Commodore ordered. General, I'm afraid you might have even more Separatists to deal with shortly. They're throwing everything they've got in the breach and hitting us all across the line. I'm not sure I have the assets to prevent the enemy from gaining and holding a foothold in orbit. May the Force be with you, Commodore Tarkin. Do your best. That's all I can ask for. Good luck, General. Tarkin out. Rex, the 501st, is with me. We'll be the operational reserve, Tai said. The Jedi waved a hand, and the projection hovering in the middle of the room shifted to show a bird's-eye view of Tipoca. There were a lot of red symbols coming down and too few blue ones rising to meet them. Give me camera feeds, the Jedi Master ordered. One of the clones manning the command center did so, and windows opened in front of the general, showing what was happening outside. Missiles, both from the Torrent squadrons and AA emplacements, rose to challenge the advancing enemy. The invaders responded in kind, with all the leading vultures opening their wings and revealing the ordnance hidden there. The night sky was lit up by scores of explosions and then torn asunder as laser cannons opened up. A few hundred vultures died screening the assault transport. The remaining droid fighters went after the surviving torrents, with a small number going in ballistic towards the city. The second group kept firing everything until they were either shot down or rammed into AA emplacements. Even the CP shook a bit after a vulture slammed nearby. Next came the transports preceded by gunships which rained hellfire upon the city. Shakti frowned when she felt a shift in the Force. She raised a hand and, without thinking, used her power to manipulate the controls. One of the windows shifted angles and showed a Separatist assault transport. From this side, it was obvious that its rear ramp was open. The camera caught it just in time to see two figures jumping out. The Jedi Master leaned forward and stared intently at that pair. The Force whispered to her they were important. The camera followed them as they fell faster than mere gravity could account for. Suddenly, they abruptly slowed down before slamming into a platform with an AA emplacement and a squad of clones providing security. The troopers were thrown away like leaves on the wind, and the weapon crumbled as if hit by giant hammer. The unknowns stood up from their landing and pulled out lightsabers, which they promptly ignited. Their blades were vibrant shade of blue. Those people were Old Republic Jedi. They should have been the Order's natural allies. Instead, members of the Council chose to ally with Vale of all people. "This is going to be unpleasant," Rex stated after seeing the Old Republic Jedi joining the fray. Damn that man and his manipulations. It was because of him and the incompetence of the Council that she was forced to go out and fight fellow Jedi. "Lucky us," Rex muttered. RK equals outer landing platforms, Tipoca City, Camino. Making an aerial insertion was still a rush even after hundreds of jumps. The only thing Romilda regretted was that she couldn't actually feel the air rushing around her thanks to the power armor encasing her. However, the capabilities of her suit more than made up for that minor inconvenience. Her HUD updated with information from the IFF beacons of her people. More than 2/3 of the company survived to make the jump, and all were already in the air. Another update and the sensor suite of the armor began noting targets spread all across the landing platforms that were her first target. The Jedi who jumped first were already landing and causing havoc. Now it was time for her unit to live up to its name. Vance designated targets for her shoulder-mounted missile pod and activated the repulsor unit to counteract the recoil before firing. 6 micro-missiles shot from their sheath, then the pod detached and flew behind her. The anti-grav unit whined as it fought to slow Romilda's descent, giving her just enough time to see the platforms being engulfed in fire. There were hundreds of missiles shot from her company alone. By the time she landed, the resistance in the immediate area was confused and had lost most of its heavy weapons. "Up and at them!" the captain shouted and charged over the bridge, leading towards the next platform. A pair of trooper who landed nearby joined her. One was a heavy weapons specialist who moved slower but compensated by suppressing the next platform with his assault cannon. The other was a marksman packing an anti-material rifle. The only one who had a prayer of slowing them down was a clone wearing one of their new heavy armors, which were practically combat exoskeletons. The man had a laser cannon of his own and shot at Romilda, who dodged by triggering her repulsor unit once she saw him aiming at her. One shot was all he could do before being staggered by a sniper round that shattered his shields and dented his armor. Vance finished him off with a burst from her own weapon meant to deal with heavy infantry. The clone's armor was simply insufficient to deal with that much firepower. His chest plate caved in, and the man was instantly cooked. Securing the next platform was as simple as disposing of a couple of wounded clones before making sure that the AA emplacement there would not fire again. After that, Romilda charged over the next bridge. The sheer shock of the explosive entry, combined with almost unrestricted air support and 20 Jedi, was more than enough to see the outer platforms fall in a short order. The enemy rallied up and put a stiffer resistance only when they reached the city itself, where the clones blew up the bridges leading to the outer platforms. That was a mere inconvenience for the Old Republic Special Forces and their Jedi allies. However, most of the droids were going to have trouble crossing until an engineering section could rig new bridges if someone figured a way to improvise. Well, there were always the still intact transports hanging back until the AA in the area was properly dealt with. "This will be interesting." Romilda smiled when he reached the enemy positions. The clones were dug in and had the higher ground. They were positioned on balconies along the buildings, across the blown-up bridges leading towards the landing platforms. They had heavy weapons too, laser cannons, missile and rocket launchers, and at least a third of them had the new weapons and armor being fielded by the New Republic. This was the kid of problems Havoc, especially when backed up by Jedi, was meant to solve. RK equals. "Captain, do you need a hand?" Newly promoted Jedi Knight Denny Strum asked after finally making her way to the front line. "We can use any assistance you can provide, Master Jedi," the power-armored woman answered. "How good is your telekinesis?" "Pretty good." "Why?" Denny answered. "We can use some makeshift cover and a way across." Captain Vance explained and then waved at the platforms behind them. "Deploy smoke grenades. My team and I will do the trick." Denny nodded. Seconds later, the whole area was covered by multispectral smoke clouds. You heard the captain, people. Follow my lead, the Jedi Knight ordered. She closed her eyes and concentrated. Her mind expanded, touched the Jedi around her, and their wills merged. It wasn't a technique that could be used for long or when under direct fire, thus the smoke, however, for as long as it lasted. One of the nearby landing pads, which was free from friendly forces, began shacking when 5 Jedi concentrated their wills upon it. It was torn away from its supporting pillar with a deafening screech of tortured metal, then slowly flew above the heads of the old Republic soldiers. It gained speed until it tore through the air with enough force to embed itself in the building on the other side of the chasm. Denny faltered from the spent energy, though she smiled at a job well done. Only a couple of meter-long gap was left between the closest platform and the one now sticking from under the enemy position. Short enough for the commando droids to jump through from a running start and trivial for Jedi and power-armored troopers to cross. Strum carefully extracted herself from the meld and sighed in relief when she felt the rest of her unit were all right, if a bit tired. That's more than good enough, Master Jedi. Go, 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 the captain ordered, and she led the charge. Denny grinned at the praise and sprinted after the older woman. =RK equals. Part 6. CIC Republic Cruiser Daring, high orbit over Camino. Daring shook as she glided over the edge of Camino's shield. She and her consorts flew so close to the energy barrier that the electromagnetic field produced by it compromised their stability. Their deflectors were at maximum power, slowly draining due to the interference. However, it was all worth it to pull of a tiny bit more speed from the Venators. Tarkin's battle group was still a minute out of range, from the Separatist battleships exploiting the hole torn into Camino's defenses. 20 Lucra hulks were advancing at the gap, which the remaining Golan stations couldn't properly interdict. Over 100 escorts were screening the battleships, taking hits, going into ramming runs, and putting a deadly umbrella barrier in place. The reserve squadrons, built from a single Venator with light cruiser and frigate escort, were entering the fray in a desperate attempt to plug the hole. Tarkin was racing there too, however he was sensing that it might already be too late. Tarkin tore away his gaze from that engagement and looked at the bigger picture. The rest of the assault was more cautious, obviously meant to pin down the bulk of the Republic fleet, while the Separatist could exploit the opening. 2 days ago it wouldn't have worked. Then Tarkin could have sent in reserves that were wasted by Ramesses. Even yesterday morning he would have something more to work with. Damn you, Tarkin hissed. He clutched his fist so hard that he could no longer properly feel his fingers. He looked back at the gap in time to see the munificent formation opening and spreading out to clear the battleship firing lanes. Half of those frigates were still intact when they should have been gutted. The reserve finally got into position, caught 7 of the munificents into crossfire and promptly shattered them. The 3 battle groups were in place, however the same was true for the battleships. All units above Tipoca City, with the exception of the reserve force, are to attack immediately, push out the enemy and move in to englobe the Separatist battleships, then concentrate fire on them. No less than 10 cruisers per Lucra hulk, Tarkin ordered. Captain, bring the battle group 15 degrees up, then straighten our course. Primary targets are the frigates and light destroyers. Once we're clear, coordinate fire on the closest battleship. Whole Venator divisions and their escorts surged forward. That bold move caught the enemy by surprise after a week-long passive defense. The Separatist escorts failed to react fast enough to the changed situation, and a third of them were caught out of position and wiped out before the rest could consolidate and form a proper formation. Whoever was in charge of the battleships reacted promptly. He kept half of them going towards the planet, while the rest changed vectors as fast as they could and moved to attack the Republic forces attempting to trap them. At last, Tarkin's cruisers were in range, and they opened fire at the enemy escorts. Munificents and recusants began dying faster. Their broadsides lacked enough punch to even slow down the armored fist, falling upon their formation. A minute later, Tarkin's battle group was through, leaving a thrice their number of gutted escorts in their wake. That was a long time for the reserve battle groups. Even combined, they had the firepower to barely take out a single battleship. The 10 coming at them, the only way to stop them was by taking a page from the Separatists' playbook and attempt a ramming run. They couldn't run, couldn't hide, and standing meant dying a bit slower. The reserves flew straight at the enemy, maneuvering so their formations came at the Separatists one after another, and thus using the ships in front as shield. Whoever thought of that needed a medal. Promotion too if they were lucky to survive. The Lucrehulks weren't maneuverable enough to evade and were already in Camino's gravity well, so escaping was out of the question. Their answer was simple: reverse thrust to slow down the approach and fire everything. The reserves ran straight into what looked like a wall made of red turbolaser fire. The leading battle group simply disintegrated, and it was soon followed by the second. The third plowed through the debris of their comrades, some of the lighter ships going out of control thanks to the collisions. The light escorts died first, simply torn to pieces from the ceaseless barrages. The light cruisers fared a bit better, though they too shattered under concentrated fire. That left a single Venator approaching the leading Lucrehulk. The cruiser's shields were on fire and soon popped up like a soap bubble touching open flame. Turbo laser fire racked the Venator, yet it was too late. It came in firing all the way, and all three battle groups were unleashing all their firepower upon that single Lucrehulk, forcing it to keep its deflectors up and particle shielding at minimum power. The Venator flew through the gap in the outer hull and struck the battleship in the center of the sphere containing its vital systems. Even the Lucrehulk's heavy armor couldn't survive such an impact. It caved and the cruiser plunged deep into the battleship's guts. The sheer momentum of the impact pushed the larger craft up and backwards before its reactor went critical and both ships went up in a blinding explosion. That sacrifice wasn't in vain. Tarkin smiled coldly when he managed to tear his gaze away from the last stand. His plan worked. The counterattack was successfully, and multiple battle groups were in position to surround the enemy battleships. The only downside was that the 9 closet to Camino were going to unload all the droids on board and send them down before he could do anything about them. Tarkin sighed. That was less than ideal, yet the best he could do. Now he had to maul those Lucrehulk before the enemy could muster a rescue force and get them out of the improvised trap. Angle us down 5 degrees, cut engines and all non-essential power, and transfer that energy to forward weapons and shields, Tarkin ordered. =RK equals. Outer landing platforms, Tipoca City, Camino. Danny used the Force to vault over the parapet at the balcony where the New Republic soldiers had taken position. When she landed, the young Jedi Knight was surrounded by both a Force barrier and a shield emitted by her custom light power armor, meant for exclusive Jedi use. Those defenses bought her the necessary few moments to gain her bearing and concentration so she could sweep the whole area off enemy soldiers by sending powerful telekinetic shockwaves to her sides. Most clones were thrown clearly off the balcony, with a few unlucky souls bouncing between the railing and the walls before finally crashing for the last time. Moments later, more remnant Jedi and troopers came up and began fanning in all directions. Clones away from the affected area attempted to bottle them up, only to face strike teams led by veteran Jedi who could withstand the firepower leveled their way and then some. The troopers protected by the Knights wasted no time in shooting up any resistance, and the advance continued without slowing down. Without proper anti-Sith or well-Jedi tactics, all the clones had on their side were numbers and firepower. Given the battlefield they fought, only the latter mattered in the short term, and the New Republic forces were soon figuring out that properly supported Jedi Knights were a nightmare to deal with. Some of them even lived long enough to tell the tale. Denny herself was on point, followed by Captain Vance's command squad and half a platoon of the expanded Havoc squad, which was now a company-sized formation. The Jedi Knight soon fell in a pattern she was familiar with from the war against the Sith: deflect the incoming blaster bolts or tank them with a force-based barrier, sent back to sender any missiles, rockets and grenades coming her way, and either reflect heavy laser shots, take out those weapons before they could fire at you, or simply don't be where they aimed when they finally took a pot shot at you. She would have been in some amount of danger in a more open battlefield. However, that simply wasn't the case in Tipoca City. The firing lines were restricted and usually funneled the enemy into coming from a single direction. Havoc dealt with anyone audacious enough to attempt a flanking maneuver, which left Danny with a reasonably simple job: to act as a mobile cover for the troopers behind her. That was something her Guardian training covered extensively as a Padawan, and she had some experience against people familiar with the tactic and knowing how to counter it. She knew the clones were going to learn sooner rather than later. It was inevitable. It was going to make no difference for this fight. Denny turned the corner to face another strong point at the end of rigged-to-blow hanging bridge. The clones stationed there opened fire with everything they got: blaster, 2 heavy repeaters, as well as a pair of grenade launchers. "Morris, do your thing," Denny ordered the best telekinetic in her team. "I'm on it," the human youth exclaimed. Denny concentrated on the task at hand. Her lightsaber became a blur as she drew more force energy into her body in order to enhance her reflexes. The world around her slowed down, allowing her to meet every single shot coming her way, though the firepower was enough that she couldn't spare the effort to properly reflect it back. Meanwhile, the grenades froze over the bridge, then suddenly flew back even faster, and before the clones could react, their position disappeared behind multiple explosions. A heartbeat later, all the explosives attached to the bridge were rudely torn from it and hurled away before someone had the presence of mind to detonate them. At least they made for nice fireworks. The enemy should have set them up to blow at the first sign of tampering. Doing so would have one way or another slowed down the advance. Denny waved for one of the other Jedi to take point until she could take a breather. She waited for the first couple of squads to cross the bridge and followed suit in the middle of the formation. Soon enough, Denny would recover and take point again. After Tython, she was eager to make those serving Viel pay for what he did to her master. RK equals GAR Command Center, Tipoca City, Camino. "We need to slow down their advance," Rex said. "Set up crossfires, call in air support, and all indirect fire assets. That might work." He thought aloud. He wondered if that's how the Separatists felt when they had to deal with a GAR unit led by a Jedi, then dismissed the idea. What he was seeing over the cameras was worse. Those enemy commandos were acting as if they had been working with the Jedi for years, perhaps decades. So far, nothing the forward-deployed GAR elements did besides blowing up bridges and wrecking as much as possible of the buildings to deny easy access seemed to slow them down. "We're fresh out of air support, boss," Fives pointed out. "Here." Shakti spoke after zooming in the map of the city floating in the middle of the chamber. "I feel this is the most dangerous enemy unit. We need to stop them now." "Plan?" Rex asked. "That's it," Boomer chuckled. "I like it. It's simple, so it's harder to get criffed up. There's a whole droid army coming for us. Unless we stop those people from gaining a bigger foothold in the city, Tipoca will be lost soon, and that's unacceptable," Shakti snapped. "Armory now. 150th, Chapter 37. Parts 1 and 2. Disclaimer: I do not own Gundam Seed or Star Wars. They belong to their respective copyright owners. This story is not created with commercial aim. I make no money from it. Phase 37, Conflagration, equals RK equals. Part 1, General Plo Koon's quarters, Republic Cruiser Gallant, Corellia. A shrill, keening noise tore Master Coon away from his meditation. He bolted up from the floor where he sat and went for his comm. "This is General Coon report." The Jedi wheezed through his breath mask. The captain's face, that of an ordinary-looking clone, appeared in front of Coon's face. "Our long-range scanners detected massive disturbance 6 light-years away. The Separatists are coming. There's too much interference and sensor ghosts to be sure of total numbers. However, there's a lot of them," the clone reported. "Rough estimates are 2 to 3 times our worst-case scenario." "I see," the Jedi said. "I trust you've called the fleets to battle stations," Coon asked, though the still roaring alarm was a dead giveaway. "Yes, sir. I'm coming to the flag bridge. Get me a conference call between Kenobi, Coburn, and Yularen," the Jedi ordered before switching off the comm and marching towards the ship's nerve center. On his way there, Coon mussed that it was a good thing High Command had criffed up their deployment orders and hadn't sent Yularen to reinforce the outer rim as he was supposed to do. The man had been surprised when he had been called for a status report and asked about the situation on Naboo when he was in fact here at Corellia overseeing the final repairs of the forces that fought at Geonosis. That administrative fiasco meant that Kenobi could remain back on Coruscant doing his job, running the whole war, while Yularen was free to command one of the reserve fleets in the Corps. That was vital, considering that Wolf was one of the few flag officers to actually command forces of the scale being deployed at Quat Corellia and in the reserves. Yularen's expertise and experience had been invaluable in setting up the training for Coon's fleet. Now it only remained to be seen how well all that effort could be put in practice. RK equals. Plo Koon entered the flag bridge and nodded in approval when he found it a hive of activity. His staff were busy updating the holotank with the status of the defense fleets. One after another, they were lighting up in green, denouncing full combat readiness. The Jedi got in just in time because the images of the people he needed to talk with appeared one after another next to the main tactical plot after he entered the compartment. "You've got a situation, Plo?" Obi-Wan asked. "Yes, it has began. Our intelligence appears to be wrong," the Jedi Master confirmed. Kenobi looked away from the comm unit and nodded. "I see. I'll talk with the relevant people. They obviously dropped the ball in a bad way. Any sign of activity on your end, Coburn?" "It's just a matter of time. As you know, last night the Separatists secured Balmorra after Ningo forced our remaining forces there to retreat. He's close enough to make it in one direct jump if he has done his homework properly." "Such a jump is quite risky," Yularen noted. "Yes, it can also bring a whole fleet on my doorstep with little to no warning." Coburn grumbled. "Thoughts?" "Is the main blow coming at Corellia?" Obi-Wan asked. "If it isn't, I hate to think what they have in store for Coburn," Coon pointed out. "It's good thing we were overly paranoid in reinforcing you both," Kenobi muttered. "We've got enough forces in place to crush what we expected to hit us." Coburn frowned. When combined with the system defense navies anyway, it wasn't a secret that the old man was pissed off that the Quat's own navy outgunned his sector fleet after recalling home all their mandators and smaller battle cruisers. Things were not so lopsided at Corellia, with only 5 of their 6 Corellian cruisers in system. They were still a formidable force, able to give Coon's own command a run for its money. When combined with the rest of Corellia's system defense navy, those ships made for a big and powerful force on their own. Plo Koon was going to need every one of them, plus some heavy reinforcements. "Kenobi, we've got a situation," Valentra's characteristic voice snapped off screen. "What?" If Obi-Wan was annoyed, it didn't show in his voice. The former Jedi looked away when suddenly his image twisted and distorted. Kenobi was saying something, however his voice came in as a garbled mess. The familiar whine produced by jamming came over the comm and Obi-Wan's image was gone. "We're trying. Sir, we can't raise HQ. I'm attempting to call the Criff." "General, I can't raise anyone at Coruscant," the comm officer exclaimed. "The Separatists couldn't have bypassed us," Coburn exclaimed. "We've got listening posts and battle groups stationed all over the core. My people can't raise Coruscant either. I have them trying to do so with the nearby systems. They'll send a scout to find out the Criff is happening at the capital," Yularen declared after speaking with someone on his side. "Gentlemen, we've got a problem. Yularen's people might very well be needed back on Coruscant in case I'm mistaken." Coburn grunted. The 3 of them looked at each other. "I'll be able to hold Corellia without reinforcements. However, in that case, most of the industry away from the planet could be written off. That's a significant chunk of our new construction. This might be a Separatist trick to paralyze our response," Yularen suggested. "Attempt to divert my forces so they can hit you without interference." "True." Plo Koon nodded. "I suggest you wait until a scout can reach Coruscant and confirm what's happening over there. I'll keep the channel open and inform you of what's really hitting Corellia. I'll be doing the same when our uninvited guests arrive here too." Coburn nodded. "Sir, update on the enemy forces. They're entering hyperspace." Plo Koon looked at the holotank. The fleets were ready. All but a handful of the battle stations were good to go and all fighter and bomber wings were manned and needed just an order to launch. "This is General Plo Koon to all Republic and Corellian forces in system. I'm assuming direct tactical command of the fleets. The enemy comes daring to challenge the Republic, democracy itself. Our very freedom." The Jedi Master spoke with conviction. "Today we draw a line and say no more. Here we stand. Here we fight. Here we win. For the Republic." As if answering his challenge, a new alarm sounded. The holotank began updating as the enemy began arriving in the system. And updating. That's a lot of red, a staff lieutenant muttered. I should have kept my mouth shut. Plo Koon groaned. The people in intelligence had criffed up so much the Jedi Master had no words. Admiral Yularen, I'll need all the reinforcements you can get to me yesterday if I'm to keep any of the industry intact. Coon turned to look at the image of the younger man. Wolf nodded. There was no doubt he was looking at the raw data being streamed to his ship. I'll get the ball rolling. We'll be there in a few hours. Admiral Coburn, I'm putting the secondary echelon reserves at your disposal. Call them if you need them. Yularen sighed. Let's just hope Coruscant isn't under attack too. Plo Koon turned his attention to the task at hand. He needed to buy time. The 5 elongated triangles, designating a Corellian cruiser, each began moving along with their escorting broods. Letting the enemy dictate the terms of the engagement was going to be suicide given their apparent numbers. The Separatists still got ships arriving in system, and they had already brought thousands of them. A very un-Jedi-like expression crossed Coon's face. This was a target-rich environment, precisely the type of battlefield the Corellian cruisers were meant to exploit. Each of them was worth roughly 1,000 recusant light destroyers or even more munificence, and the Jedi Master just unleashed them all upon the enemy. =RK equals. Part 2. Garage, Borealis, Coruscant. Sir, I'll really appreciate if one of these days you begin keeping a lower profile. Agent Bail Kyle grumbled. He was the man unlucky enough to be in charge of Director Yilei's security detail, something that was hard on the nerves. Bale was a middle-aged human whose hair was already turning silver thanks to all the stress he had to deal with on a daily basis. His boss's various excursions all across Coruscant weren't helping. Nonsense, we've finally got the place more or less secured. Besides, who's going to be aiming at me when there are so many more juicy targets on Coruscant? Marek chuckled and held the aircar door open for his wife, who simply shook her head at their antics and got inside after giving Kyle an apologetic look. Every single Seppi in the region? Bale sighed. We got most of the bastards. The director smiled. Most is most certainly not all, boss, the agent pointed out. Fine, rain on my parade. What's the next stop? Yilei asked. That would be the day. The director smiled and got into the aircar. Bale looked around, nodded to the rest of the security detail, and went into one of the other cars of the small convoy. So far, so good. Prism, Pillar Actual, we're leaving, Kyle called the central. Anything of note? Over. Pillar Actual, Prism, negative. Everything looks fine. No new alerts and nothing out of the ordinary on the scanners. Have a nice trip, over. We're a go, folks. Let's try not to end the day by criffing up, all right? Kyle called the rest of the security detail, earning himself a few tired chuckles. The convoy headed towards the exit when a bright flash of light blinded Bale. The following thunderclap was little more than an afterthought because he was too busy being tossed around when his car was picked up and sent skidding across the floor by a shockwave. When Kyle was coherent again, the first thing he noticed was sharp pain in his side, arm and back. Only then he began remembering that something went terribly wrong. Prism, Pillar Actual, 3 was an explosion. Bale wheezed in his comm. We need assistance. The agent found that talking and breathing was getting harder. Kyle looked around, and even that little motion sent red-hot pain running up his back. A distant part of his mind concluded that hurting was good. It meant he wasn't paralyzed. Bale saw that his car was more or less upright, though the people inside were at least as bad hurt as he was. He appeared to be the only one conscious at the time. Kyle carefully turned his head and looked around. There was a smoking pile of debris in the middle of the garage. If he didn't know better, he would have thought they were all that was left from the director's car. Oh, wait. Kyle blinked and swore quietly. That was Yilei's car. =RK equals. Jedi Master Piel's quarters, Jedi Temple. Why did you call us all here? Teen Susurutin. We just got a data file from our friends. You need to see it now. The small Jedi grumbled. He waved his co-conspirators to get inside and close the door before plugging a data chip in a hollow projector built into his dining table. Piel proceeded to go fast forward the piece of Separatist propaganda until the announcement that Dooku had been handed to the Jedi. We've got hours at best, before this become public knowledge here on Coruscant. Less before the Chancellor sees this and begins wondering what his apprentice has been telling us. Do I need to go on? Piel spat. We're out of time. Kota nodded. I'll go pick up our friend, who is coming with us to talk with the Chancellor about this recording. This is information he simply needs to see. Ram smiled thinly. I agree, Master Dralig said. I'll get everything moving here. How long do you need before we can go loud? I'll talk with Yoda. He'll be seeing our other problem student. Then I'm off to our waylaid friend. Tien smiled sadly. It's decided then. Master Yaddle sighed. All right, Sin, I'll collect your Padawan and we'll go check up on the younglings. They can use a walk to stretch their legs. I'll go talk with the Chancellor too then. Piel looked around. Any second thoughts? We're already too deep for those. Kota snorted. We're already committed and our hands are dirty. The only thing left is to see if we can neutralize the Sith or not. May the Force be with us all. Tien gave the assembled Jedi a deep bow and left the room, with Piel and Kota following behind. I certainly hope so. Otherwise all this is going to be for nothing, Yaddle muttered. We'll make sure that the order doesn't end today. That's all we can do, Dralig told her. The rest is up to the Force. I trust the Force not to criff up. I can't necessarily say the same for the Jedi who let things get so bad without noticing. Yaddle chuckled sadly. Most certainly, we aren't blameless. We should have acted when Yoda told us about the Sith all those months ago. We were blind, complacent, and now it's time to pay the price. The tiny woman frowned. I regret that we won't be the only one affected by the fallout. No matter what, things are going to get worse before they can get better. Come on, we have some youngsters to pick up. Equals RK equals SIB Safe House, Coruscant. Can you feel it, Mace? Dooku asked. The Count was sitting next to his one-time friend, who was his jailer nowadays, and sharing a cup of tea with the man. Changes in the air. I can. Windu nodded. The Force is trembling in anticipation. The former Jedi Master put down his cup. It's going to be today. Soon. Have you decided what to do with me? Dooku asked. He didn't appear to care one way or another. We might still go with Ivan's plan. That idea has potential, unless Sidious decides to simply play along as the tired old man. Dooku frowned. He has that routine down to perfection. We'll do what we have to. Mace paused and looked at the front door. They weren't expecting visitors today. However, he could sense two familiar Force signatures ready to enter. It's time, Windu said and stood up. We're out of time. Palpatine will know very soon that we have him. The short Jedi pointed at Dooku. Ah, the game is up indeed. The Count smiled. What is going to be? You're coming with us, Dooku. The Chancellor will want to know if we have you. Windu smiled. We're going to give him what he wants. Mace turned towards the other Jedi. Have you called our allies? They're moving as we speak. The timing might have been better, however we have most pieces in place. Kota noted. My people are in position. The same goes for Silvaris. Let's go then. Time is running out. I can feel it. Windu told them. Equals RK equals. CIS battleship, warrior spirit, high orbit over Camino. It's done. The enemy air force is suppressed. We've got a secure beachhead at the capital. You're clear to deploy, General, Admiral Kirst announced. Lockdurd beamed at the news. Splendid. I've got my new weapons ready to deploy and all those grim folks just waiting to exploit my success. The Nemoidian waved at the power-armored men getting into assault transports all around the hangar. Just try not to have friendly fire accidents. Our new allies won't appreciate it and they will be in position to do something about it. Kirst glared at the general. Oh, psh, there's nothing to worry about. I've tested my weapon against their nice armor. Durd frowned. It keeps it all out. Then he beamed again. However, the Republic's suits aren't as good. Huh. No worries, I say. Everything is going to be just fine. Locke waved at the Admiral, who glared back. Equals RK equals. Outskirts, Tipoca City, Camino. Using Tipoca's cameras, Rex was able to track their target's progress and deploy his men for what he hoped was a good ambush. He waited the remnant or whatever they called to enter the large building, which was the most direct way towards the center of the city, and ordered the 501st to begin converging on their positions. Meanwhile, he kept tracking the enemy to ensure there wouldn't be any unpleasant surprises. After seeing the remnant in action, Rex dismissed any notions in bringing heavy troopers. The better armor and shields simply weren't enough to stand up to the firepower brought by the enemy. Instead, he opted for medium and light armor, thus relying on mobility and stealth. Still, he had his brothers grab the heaviest weapons they could. The firepower was going to be vital. "They're getting near," Shak Ti whispered. "My people are in position. 30 seconds and all squads will be ready to strike," Rex said after consulting the camera feeds. The enemy was moving in a long column with Jedi leading the way and taking up the rear. There was none of those in the middle of their formation at this time, which was going to be a boon, or so Rex hoped. He looked at the Jedi Master, who simply nodded. Rex sent 2 clicks over the comm. That was the signal. 20 seconds and the 501st was going to charge the enemy from the various side passages honeycombing the building. Shak Ti used the remaining time to stealthily move towards the corner end of the corridor where the enemy was coming from. She drew her lightsaber, waved to the clones behind her to follow. Time was up. "Ambush!" someone shouted mere moments before the 501st struck. Rex didn't need the cameras to know that the enemy were scattering and covering all the approaches. He cursed and sprinted after Shak Ti, who activated her lightsaber and vanished behind the corner.